Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, a place where we move slowly through the hidden depths of Earth's own story. Together, we linger with ideas, letting them drift, settle, and reshape the way we see the ground beneath our feet. Tonight, I'd like us to step, not into bedtime, not into history, but into something in between the two, a question that feels both impossibly vast and strangely intimate. What if the Earth itself remembered? Before we travel further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now, as these words reach you? Are you resting in a quiet room, letting the night air cool against the window? Or are you somewhere closer to the hum of the world, with traffic or voices still moving outside? Wherever you are, can you imagine, just for a moment, that the ground beneath your building, your street, your small corner of the planet, is still alive with memories? Layers of ancient forests pressed into stone, the breath of long-extinct animals lingering as trace gases sealed in minerals, the softest echoes of rain that fell hundreds of millions of years ago caught forever in a crystal. If the Earth remembers, perhaps it is through these quiet geological archives, where entropy moves slowly, like a clock made of dust. And so tonight, let us wander back to the time when all the continents were one, when the oceans broke against a single vast supercontinent we now call Pangea. Imagine this land not as a map in a textbook, but as something that once had texture, weight, and presence. Forests stretching from one edge of the horizon to the other, enormous rivers carving lines into red sediment, deserts blooming beneath skies heavy with volcanic haze. And there, among the shifting landscapes, great animals walked. Megafauna whose bones were heavy enough to bend the earth beneath them, whose paths marked migrations not just of survival, but of entire ecologies carried across deep time. It can feel impossible to picture, but if we pause long enough, opening ourselves to the deep silence, we start to sense it, the faint impression of a world that once pulsed as one heart. What if we could hear that pulse still? Geology suggests that, in tiny ways, we can. Fossils whisper of vanished landscapes. Isotopes, captured in teeth and sediments, reveal patterns of droughts and rains, telling us that the climate of Pangea was not static but restless, breathing in cycles of humidity and fire. Volcanic layers testify to moments when skies darkened and ecosystems shifted. If we listen carefully, it is as though the Earth is not just rock and mineral, but a vast recording, playing back slowly in the language of erosion and decay. Not music as we know it, not storytelling as we practice it, but memory measured through stone. And here we are, billions of years younger than the rocks beneath our feet, trying to read these traces as though they could tell us who we are. Maybe they do, because when a fossil is uncovered, when a layer of sandstone reveals pollen from a forest long gone, or when trapped carbon dioxide in an ancient rock tells us of an atmosphere stranger than today's, we are not just learning about what was. We are meeting a form of memory that is not ours but still belongs to us. It humbles us, reminds us that even the strongest walls we build, the tallest towers we raise, are grains of dust compared to this endurance. Still, it leaves us with questions. If the planet keeps the imprints of forests and animals from 200 million years ago, will it also remember us? Will our age be marked by technofossils, plastics hardened into stone, metals out of place in sediment, isotopes shifted by nuclear fire? What if, hundreds of millions of years in the future, another intelligence reads our layer and wonders if we ever truly realized how brief we were? Perhaps the deepest memory of Earth is not only mountains and forests, but the silence that follows when life has moved on. And yet, even as we imagine this silence, we are still drawn to listen in. Because memory is not about permanence, but about recognition. The fact that dust can hold the essence of a forest, that rock can cradle the weight of an animal's last breath, is enough to let us feel a bond across impossible distances of time. And in that bond lies wonder. Not because it proves the past survived, but because it shows that nothing is ever entirely gone. It only changes form. So tonight we stand at the threshold of a journey. The journey through Pangea, through its vast and shifting habitats, through the giants and shadows that walked its landscapes. The Earth remembers, and in remembering, it invites us to listen. And yet, if this much can be held in silence, What else might lie hidden in the pulse of the planet's shifting heart? Beneath the vast body of Pangea, there was never stillness. What seemed on the surface like steady plains and endless forests was, deep below, a slow, restless pulse. The Earth moved, almost invisibly, through the great mechanism of plate tectonics. Entire slabs of crust pressed and pulled against one another, their boundaries grinding, their edges bending. This motion was not sudden in the way we measure human moments. It was movement stretched into the patience of millions of years, so slow it seemed like silence, and yet every life that walked above was shaped by it. Rivers did not carve their valleys by chance. Forests did not rise where they did by accident. The tectonic heartbeat determined the shape of habitable worlds long before creatures filled them. Imagine standing on the shore of Pangea, looking out across the superocean Panthalassa. What you saw as still horizon was, in fact, a floating raft of continent, carried on the churning mantle below. Heat rose outward from the deep earth, currents of molten rock circulating like the blood of the planet itself. Where heat collected, mountains rose. Where the crust grew thin, volcanic fire bled through. Entire ecosystems of herbivores and predators depended on these fractures, for the soil that blooms from ash is richer than any other. Even extinction carried renewal, written in layers of cooled basalt that anchored the growth of new forests. Science tells us this through the language of geology, through folded rock, through isotopes that betray fire long cooled, through magnetic minerals aligned with poles that no longer exist. Each fragment of stone is a syllable in the Earth's slow confession. And if we listen closely enough, we can almost hear the steady rhythm of the mantle beneath, the shifting, the drifting, the heartbeat. Not because the Earth wanted to create or to destroy, but because it could not be otherwise. Movement, after all, is the consequence of heat, and heat is the consequence of time itself. On Pangea, this pulse of creation and destruction was everywhere. River plains stretched wide across the central supercontinent, fed by mountain ranges sculpted long before by tectonic lift. Where the crust tore slightly apart, rift valleys opened, shallow depressions that gathered lakes, cradling life that thrived in isolation, species that would leave no trace except their fossils sealed in sediment. In other places, subduction dragged entire slabs of seafloor back down into the planet's interior, carrying with it ocean sediments, buried shells, even the chemical fingerprints of ancient atmospheres. What we call rocks are not just objects. They are memory in motion, fragments recycled again and again by that unseen planetary pulse. And as life grew larger, more complex, more daring across the supercontinent, it did so on land that was never entirely steady. Imagine titanic creatures thundering across plains, unaware that the land beneath was splitting inch by inch, millimeter by millimeter, until one day, far beyond their perception, the continent itself would break apart. Did they feel any faint vibration beneath their steps? Or was it too slow, too soft, hidden beneath generations that rose and fell before the land truly changed? Perhaps creatures do not need to notice such motions for them to matter. The tectonic heartbeat shapes us not by asking for recognition, but by simply continuing, always beneath awareness, always beneath memory. Even the air they breathed was influenced by this pulse. Subduction recycled carbon back into the mantle. Volcanoes expelled it again into the skies, balancing atmospheres, altering climates, setting into motion droughts and monsoons alike. Life adapted again, sometimes thrived, sometimes faded into silence. All of it was tethered to Earth's quiet breathing, proof that even the atmosphere is not truly separate but bound to the rhythm of rocks shifting deep inside the planet. And so, the tectonic heartbeat can be felt not only in the grandeur of mountains or in the destruction of eruptions but in every subtle curve of soil, every pattern of rain, every lineage of life that learned to bend with a changing stage. Plate by plate, layer by layer, the silent pulse of the planet left its imprint on habitats that would one day be nothing more than red stone. And yet, the remnants of movement linger within those stones, and within us too, as we walk on ground that carries the memory of fire. It is humbling to wonder, if the land itself is always moving, reshaping, forgetting, remembering, Then what does permanence mean? Could it be that even the strongest mountain range is only a brief pause in the Earth's long exhale? And if so, maybe we, too, are pauses, brief interruptions in an ongoing rhythm that does not end, only changes form. The heartbeat slows, but it never stops. It waits, beneath silence, for us to listen. And if the ground beneath Pangea could move so steadily, shaping every forest and desert in its path, what other landscapes, what other worlds, might have been drawn and erased by the Earth's tectonic breath? The forests of Pangea were not modest places. They were endless, rising in tangled reaches of green where conifers towered higher than anything we recognize today. Trunks stretched wide, bark thick with centuries of weather, roots coiled deep into soils that remembered the breath of long droughts and the hush of heavy rains. If you walked beneath them, the canopy overhead would have closed like a ceiling of needles and shadow, filtering daylight into soft cathedral light. Time there did not move in minutes or hours, but in rhythms of growth rings, of falling cones, of rivers adjusting their paths slowly between roots. To stand in this expanse was to be reminded that the earth itself can speak through stillness. Every tree carried the memory of its climate. The narrow spacing of its rings recorded years when rain came sparingly, when heat pressed the land into fatigue. Wider rings spoke of seasons when floods replenished the soil. In these silent forests, isotopes embedded themselves within wood fibers, capturing chemical echoes of the very air the trees once breathed. And even as those trees have long crumbled to fossilized carbon, the memory persists, whispering to scientists who can read them. In this sense, the forests were not just habitats. They were records, libraries written in lifespans of pine and cypress, each page inscribed with conditions under which life thrived or strained. And beneath this monumental canopy, life of equal wonder moved. Megafauna grazed along the open glades where light streamed through broken branches. They were creatures of extraordinary scale, massive herbivores whose steps bent grass and pressed trails into wet soil, predators who moved like shadows between moss-covered trunks. To see them gathered would be to sense the slowness of their time. Migrations measured not in days but in seasons, their bodies growing slowly, shaped by years of foraging, their lives unfolding in cycles far longer than our own. In their presence, time itself seemed to change speed, measured not by clocks but by footsteps and rainfalls. Imagine the silence among them, not absence of sound, but the kind of silence filled with breathing, the crunch of trunks under tusks, the low calls carried through mist. That silence is perhaps the closest we can come to feeling the forest as it once was. It was a silence made possible only because everything existed in balance. Tree roots drawing minerals from volcanic ash, rivers scattering silt rich with nutrients, megafauna fertilizing the soil with each passing herd, predators culling and shaping populations, insects tirelessly weaving pollination into cycles of renewal. It was not harmony as we often picture it, perfect and unbroken, but harmony as reality creates it. Dynamic, shifting, occasionally destructive, yet always reshaping itself to endure. Geology reminds us that these forests, vast as they were, leaned heavily on forces beneath notice. The mountains provided rain shadows and runoff. Earth's tectonic uplift poured minerals into the soil. Volcanic eruptions reset ecosystems, wiping clearings that allowed new generations of trees to rise. In this slow interplay between destruction and renewal, the forests expanded across much of Pangea, entire regions becoming seas of needled green. And though the land would someday fracture into our modern continents, the echo of these forests remains in scattered fossils, in petrified trunks preserved like monuments, in the impressions of cones forever pressed into stone, in traces of buried pollen that drifted down and became sealed into ancient sediment. These subtle remnants tell us the forests were not merely background. They were the stage upon which the drama of deep time unfolded. And perhaps they carried something more subtle too. Perhaps they reminded the creatures living among them of slowness, of endurance. If you lived your days in the shade of giants that could outlive your lineage, what meaning would urgency hold? Would you not measure life differently, against the cycle of rivers, against the crack of lightning splitting bark, against the quiet knowledge that the trees around you could still stand long after you had returned to dust? Maybe the forests of Pangea taught patience, simply by being present. Today, we can only imagine. We can trace the isotopes locked in fossilized wood, follow the chemistry of carbon buried and recycled, study the pathways of extinction that once shifted as climates dried and thick forests gave way to deserts. But to truly know the forests of Titans is impossible. We can only lie awake and let wonder fill the spaces science cannot reach. What did those canopies smell like? What hue did the shadows take in evening light? Did dust settle differently beneath the feet of the colossi than it does beneath ours? And yet, as mysterious as they remain, we know one thing. They were vital. They controlled water, filtered oxygen, shaped soil that gave rise to colossi of both plant and flesh. The forests were not simply scenery, they were breath itself. And when they vanished, whether to flame, drought, or slow tectonic drift, their loss rippled through every creature that depended on them. The silence after their absence must have been as profound as the silence they once held within them. Still, if the forests of Titans could rise where once there was only stone, then perhaps destruction itself is not an ending at all, but a clearing for something new. And yet, as we stand within this memory, it begs us to wonder, what happens when silence falls not in glades of trees, but across entire continents? The deserts of Pangea were oceans made not of water but of silence and dust. They stretched further than the eye could wander, horizons dissolving into mirages where the air itself seemed to shimmer with fatigue. Heat pressed downward like a hand, sculpting the land into shifting dunes and jagged canyons carved by winds that never seemed to end. And yet, within these harsh expanses, life endured. Giant reptiles with scales patterned like cracked stone crossed the emptiness one measured step at a time. Early mammals, small and vulnerable, searched for burrows, clinging to scraps of shade and pockets of water that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Theirs was a fragile existence, relying on moments of chance, cycles of adaptation, answers to conditions that shifted too quickly for permanence. But nothing here was empty. Sand carried memory. Each grain had once been mountain, shattered by the patient weight of time, reduced by rain, by frost, by erosion until nothing remained but glittering fragments. To walk across a dune was to tread upon ruined landscapes, to step through the slow mathematics of entropy. Even the winds that sculpted arches, pillars, and valleys across these spaces were carrying a form of memory, moving, collecting, and redepositing sediments in patterns as old as air itself. In geology, we see these marks still, vast deposits of cross-bedded sandstone, their angled layers recording the journey of dunes that marched for millions of years. What was once shifting and fluid has stiffened into monuments, silent testimonies of deserts older than any human imagination. Life in such landscapes was not abundant, but it was resilient. Herbivorous reptiles grazed wherever hardy plants pushed their roots deep enough to find water. Predators lingered at the edges, their strength balanced carefully against scarcity. Mammals the size of small shadows crept through dry lowlands, invisible but determined, their survival not in grandeur but in resourcefulness. The desert, though hostile, shaped minds of endurance. It did not allow excess. It demanded patience, silence, and a willingness to vanish into the background. Perhaps this is why the earliest mammals found their way here. They needed land where giants could not thrive, where the weight of size might bend into disadvantage. The dunes, shifting relentlessly, erased footprints even as they were made, allowing survival to be not just an act of persistence, but of constant forgetting. Atmosphere itself conspired to shape these zones. Much of Pangea sat far from oceans, its inner lands so removed that rainfall rarely arrived. Monsoons circled the coasts, but in the heart of the supercontinent, the air fell dry, drained of its weight of moisture. Isotopes preserved in ancient soils reveal cycles of drought, patterns where wet years carved temporary rivers followed by centuries of silence. These isotope trails act as the Earth's quiet memory, showing that what creatures endured here was not a mistake of nature but a rhythm, a long pulse between scarcity and absence. We like to think of deserts as lifeless, Yet in their very emptiness they offer a deeper lesson. Sometimes survival requires not filling space, but enduring it. What must it have felt like for a creature to live in such silence? The wind carrying dust like whispers, the sky vast and scorched, the ground heated until it cracked in lines like broken pottery. No thick canopies to offer comfort, no rushing rivers to guarantee a drink. Only the endless openness, a stage with very few actors. And yet there must have been beauty, too. Stars unveiled by the absence of trees, night skies wider here than anywhere else, heat fading into cool evenings, when shadows grew long and animals dared to emerge from their hiding places. The desert taught not only caution, but rhythm. To move at dusk, to drink before dawn, to hide before the return of unbearable light. Even in their silence, deserts leave behind a story. Today, we uncover their memory in fossil beds buried under sandstone. Preserved skeletons of reptiles lie hidden where dunes once rolled endlessly across the land. Pollen and spores, carried by storms, became embedded between layers, telling us that pockets of vegetation clung like green oases in seas of red sand. Each fossil, each imprint, reveals that desert was not absence but a stage of delicate equilibrium, where existence itself was a rare triumph. And perhaps, deserts are the earth reminding us of limits, a reminder that abundance is never permanent, that every fertile river plain can become a wasteland, and every wasteland can in time transform again into forest. Nothing static, nothing promised, only cycles. Perhaps this is why deserts feel eternal when we gaze across them. They embody not death but pause, a suspension of what life usually looks like. The winds blew across Pangea's deserts for millions of years, carrying not just sand, but time itself. Silence reigned here, yes, but it was never blank silence. It was the silence of erasure, of stories retold again and again by dunes shifting into new forms, by creatures daring to live where seemingly nothing could. And if deserts can carry such echoes within emptiness, it leaves us to wonder. What songs might the shores of this supercontinent have carried, where land met the restless tide? The edges of Pangea were never still. They were shifting, restless borders, where land surrendered to the sea and the sea pressed endlessly back against the land. Here, at the margins of the supercontinent, life gathered in abundance. Tidal flats stretched outward like mirrors, reflecting broad skies in their thin film of water. Estuaries wound between deltas, carrying fresh river currents into salt. Shallow lagoons pooled behind protective sandbars, warm and still, cradling communities that could not survive the open ocean. These were the shores of the supercontinent, transitional worlds, soft edges where boundaries blurred and possibility thrived. In these intertidal places, the breath of the planet felt close. Twice a day, the tides advanced and retreated, pulling nutrients in, leaving traces behind. Each swell deposited layers of silt and mud, draping the land in fine sediment that would one day harden into stone. And within that sediment, fragile bodies rested. Shells, bones, the outlines of plants, they sank silently beneath waterlogged sand and silt, where oxygen was sparse and decay was slowed. Time thickened there, each tide another thin curtain drawn over memory. Fossilization began not through design, but through accident, an interplay of chemistry, burial, and chance. What was once living began its slow transition into permanence. Imagine walking across such a shoreline, though no human feet ever did. The calls of reptilian creatures carried across mudflats, their tracks pressed deep into the soft ground. Pterosaurs wheeled overhead, banking low to catch fish in shallow waves. Insects swarmed where brackish water fed reeds that swayed in the warm air. Even the smallest traces, a claw mark, a drifted leaf, a ripple frozen in silt, were drawn into this sedimentary canvas. Millions of years later, those imprints remain, hardened beneath layers of compressed time. The shores of Pangea remind us that memory does not need to be conscious. It can be embedded in stone, awaiting rediscovery. The life that flourished here lived in cycles balanced on tides and storms. Estuaries became nurseries for fragile young, their shallow waters safe from deep predators. Lagoons enclosed delicate ecosystems where conditions tilted between salt and fresh, forcing creatures to learn resilience. The coastal air itself was different, heavy with salt spray, infused with organic sense of decay and growth, carrying a sense of transition that marked these spaces as liminal, half land, half sea, never wholly either. Geology allows us to glimpse this world now, through layered rocks that record seas rising and falling again and again. Limestone beds mark the shallows of ancient lagoons, storing the skeletons of corals and shellfish. Sandstones preserve ripple marks identical to those left by waves today. And in rare sites, trackways of reptiles crossing mudflats reveal not just their presence, but their direction, their weight, the way they paused or hurried. These traces remind us how much the earth can remember simply by layering dust upon dust, age upon age. And as with all memory, much is lost, but enough remains to tell us that life at the shores was rich, intricate, and always changing. Perhaps this is the lesson of coasts, that no line endures. The sea advanced, the sea retreated, and with each cycle habitats shifted. What was an estuary became a swamp. What was once a lagoon hardened into desert plain. What had been tide-washed sand became mountain stone. Nothing at the edge holds still. But precisely in that instability, life found its greatest abundance. Maybe there's something in that rhythm that speaks to us still, the idea that we are most alive not in permanence, but at the borders, the thresholds, the places where change is constant. As the waves of Panthalassa struck against Pangea's sheer cliffs and seeped quietly into its lagoons, a record was being written beneath layers of silt. A record of scales and shells, of footsteps and storms. Each bone carried into the shallows had a chance, rare but real, of being preserved into deep time. And so, the coastline was not merely scenery for life. It was an archive, a boundary where the planet itself acted as memory keeper. And yet, if so much was captured in these shallow places, how much more might have been lost? Carried away into deep waters, dissolved into acid tides, erased forever by the rhythm of waves? If the shores of Pangea show us only fragments, what forgotten worlds might still sleep beneath the oldest seas? Across the broad interior of Pangea, where forests fell away and deserts thinned, there opened a different kind of world, vast plains of grasses and ferns stretching without end, rolling gently beneath skies unbroken by canopy or stone. These were the grasslands of the supercontinent, and their rulers were not invisible or small. They were giants, herbivores so immense they carried entire ecosystems on their backs, their presence shaping the land as much as the land shaped them. To see them was to see the earth itself in motion. Each herd a migration of hills across a moving stage, each step echoing in dust that would settle like a faint language into stone. They moved with patience, not in chaos, for migration was more than instinct. It was a deep alignment with forces written into the very chemistry of the world. Isotopes of oxygen and carbon, locked into the enamel of their teeth, record the cycles of their journeys even now. As they grazed, drank, and moved across shifting seasons, their bones became maps of climate. Within their bodies, the earth inscribed its fluctuations. Wet years marked differently from dry, seasons of abundant growth etched separately from seasons of ash. These records survive far beyond the lifespans of the creatures themselves, as if memory had chosen to carve itself not into minds, but into bone and enamel, where it could remain untouched by forgetting. Imagine walking at their side, a single human-sized observer among towers of moving life. The air would thrum with the vibrations of countless steps. Dust clouds rose in layers above them, turning the sunlight into muted gold as herds stretched far beyond the horizon. Their shadows fell like continents upon the ground. Each creature carried not just mass, but influence. As they grazed, they opened space for new plants, scattering seeds and shaping soil with every motion. Even their waste returned nutrients to the plains, feeding insects and microbes that rewove it back into fertility. Giants are never only individuals, they are landscapes in motion, ecosystems embodied. Predators followed at a distance, watching, waiting, but in the vast openness of the plains, they were minor notes in a symphony of herbivores. What truly dictated survival here was not tooth or claw, but the availability of water, the rhythm of rains, the cool shade of seasonal floods. Some years were generous, rivers swelling to feed lakes that dotted the plains. Others were harsh, when monsoon clouds failed to reach far inland and the grasslands cracked under prolonged drought. Migration was a way of life, a memory in movement. These giants not only crossed distances, they carried the memory of past lands with them, tracing routes their ancestors had walked long before. From a geological view, their presence remains long after their bodies fell. Their tracks, pressed deep into mud, hardened into stone, now reveal the size of their gatherings. Some sites preserve whole herds captured mid-journey, their footprints like pages in a planetary diary. Bones buried in red sediments speak of mass life, not scattered chance. They reveal continuity, communities bound together not by choice, but by necessity, following environmental patterns that outlasted any single generation. And yet, to picture them only as herds is to forget their individuality. Each animal followed the herd, yes, but also lived its own small life, searching for water, caring for young, resting beneath sparse shade. Were they aware of their scale? Did they feel the weight of their own shadow stretching across the endless plains? Perhaps they did not need to. Perhaps scale did not matter because life in those open spaces was not about power but about balance. The grasslands could support them only so long as they kept moving, so long as their numbers adjusted to the land's silent capacity. The grass itself was quiet memory, feeding on sunlight and the minerals released by shifting soils. When drought drove giants onward, grasses shrank back and waited. When rains returned, they resurfaced in swells of green, as though the land exhaled into abundance. From a distance, the giants were hills across a swaying ocean. Up close, they were living testaments to cooperation with cycles far larger than themselves. Every bite, every step, every migration was tethered to deep time, written again and again into fossilized evidence waiting quietly in the Earth's archive. It is humbling to remember that we, too, carry such traces. Our teeth, our bones, our very breath mark the chemical imprint of where we live, what we eat, what climates sustain us. Just as isotope trails in Pangea's giants preserve vanished cycles, so too does our biology become a fleeting record of the present world. One day, perhaps, we will be read in the same way, remembered not for what we thought, but for what we carried in the deep structures of our being. And so, the giants of the grasslands were not only witnesses of their world, they were vessels of its continuity. They remembered in bone what no eye could recall, migration after migration, season after season, across plains that seemed endless and skies that seemed eternal. But the plains did not last. Even their openness, even their abundance was subject to change. And yet, if so much could depend on creatures large enough to shape horizons, what stories must lie hidden in the hunters who followed them through dust and dusk? In the open plains of Pangea, after the herds passed and their dust settled into a soft haze above the horizon, there was another presence, quieter, hidden, and patient. Shadows moved among the grasses and the fractured ground, predators whose lives depended not on abundance, but on timing. They did not announce themselves with roar or frenzy. Instead, they waited, blending into drought-thinned shrubs, crouching near riverbeds where thirsty giants strayed, slipping behind fractured stone as if part of the land itself. Their silence was not absence, but focus. Each movement was measured, not just tooth and claw, but balance written into muscle and rhythm. To imagine them is to imagine an earth where survival rested on such patience. Giant reptiles crouched low, teeth hidden, their bodies warmed by sunlit stone until twilight loosened the heat. Early predatory mammals, still small in stature but alert with endurance, skittered at the edges, hunting insects and small vertebrates where the broader shadows had no need to tread. And above, smaller carnivores tracked the herds with persistence, not to strike the strongest, but to wait for what was fragile. A weakened individual, an isolated calf, a creature slowed by thirst. Predators, in their quiet, became the sculptors of balance, trimming away what the ecosystem could not carry. It was not cruelty, it was continuity. The dust carried their presence long after they had passed. Fine sediments trapped footprints, claw marks in dry riverbeds, trails pressed into mudflats that later hardened into stone. Today, paleontologists can follow these fossilized impressions, reading the hidden lives of those shadows. One footprint shows the spread of weight at the moment of attack. Another reveals a careful stalk. Together, they remind us that hunting is not always about carnage. Often, it is about waiting, about aligning oneself with the rhythms of a fragile world. In times of drought, when the rivers shrank and grasses withered, the role of predators grew sharper still. They became reminders of limitation. Herds could not overgraze when every step was measured by the chance of being taken. Populations thinned, but balance endured. Without predators, grasslands might have been stripped bare, rivers drained faster, dust choked with excess life unable to sustain itself. The act of predation, brutal as it may seem, was quietly merciful in a larger sense. It was the Earth's way of keeping time with itself, ensuring that nothing grew too far beyond what could be held. Perhaps, then, predators were keepers of restraint. Their patience mirrored geological patience. Just as erosion wears down mountains not in haste but in decades folded into eons, predators shifted balance not by slaughter, but by precision. They were entropy in motion, breaking down what could not continue, recycling energy into forms that would feed scavengers, insects, soil, and eventually new growth. To watch them, had we been able, would have been to watch the laws of ecology written into action. Slow, inevitable, and strangely necessary. Philosophy touches us gently here. If balance is found through removal, does the same apply to memory? Just as predators erased individuals to preserve the whole, perhaps forgetting erases details to preserve identity across time. Could it be that Earth forgets and remembers through cycles of loss, keeping only what can endure? Ecosystems lived within this paradox. Each death, forgotten quickly in dust, carried the weight of continuity forward, living proof that erasure and survival are not opposites, but partners. Though science allows us to speak of isotopes in bones and track marks in stone, the feeling of these predators is harder to reach. They were not merely biological forms but presences, shadows that transformed silence into expectation. To walk through their land would have meant sensing the subtle change in air, the hush of other animals aware of being watched, the stillness where insects quieted momentarily, as though even the smallest wings recognized the gaze of unseen eyes. The land itself seemed to lean into silence when predators lingered, as if acknowledging their place in the rhythm of life. And yet, these predators too were vulnerable. As climates shifted, as deserts expanded, their prey grew scarce. Fossil records show extinctions moving like ripples through time, where hunters once abundant became ghosts. Balanced as the system seemed, nothing was permanent. Not the herds, not the hunters, not the plains themselves. Perhaps this is the true lesson of predators. Not permanence, but fragility. Their bodies dissolved into sediment, their stories into gaps in stone. Only fragments endure. A tooth, a claw, a ripple of steps pressed into ancient mud. Still, in their silence remains a quiet reassurance. That life does not need abundance to matter. That even shadows carry importance, shaping futures beyond their own. Predators walked Pangea not as destroyers, but as keepers, shadows whose lives stitched balance into the fabric of ecosystems that seemed eternal. And yet, if shadows played such a role in the dust of open plains, what deeper memories might flow within the river valleys, where water carried not silence but song. The rivers of Pangea were more than moving water. They were memory in motion, lines drawn across the supercontinent where time itself seemed to flow. To look upon those ancient currents would have been to see more than a channel of liquid running toward the sea. Each carried the weight of whole landscapes, silt ground from mountains, grains of sand weathered from stone, pollen drifting from vanished forests, even fragments of bone carried gently toward burial. To follow a river was to trace the quiet story of erosion and renewal, each bend recording something lost, each deposit something remembered. They were not simply features of geography. but the Earth's own handwriting, written by water. Sediment moved with patience, more patient even than the forests or the plains. A single pebble tumbled across the riverbed might take centuries to reach the ocean, reshaped at every turn. Finer materials, silt, clay, particles smaller than dust, slipped into suspension, milky and restless, eventually settling out in calm floodplains where time slowed down. These floodplains became libraries of subtle stories. Year upon year, rivers dropped new layers, taking with them the record of droughts and storms. In wet years, thick deposits spoke of abundance. In leaner ones, thinner seams revealed how little the river had to carry. Today we read these lines in lithified sandstone and mudstone, thin sheets stacked in sequence, each representing seasons that vanished millions of years before anyone could give them a name. Not just rock, but life moved with the current. Pollen traced the outlines of invisible forests. Tiny shells of planktonic creatures rode the freshwaters into lagoons. Even bones descended into rivers, some fragments carried far to the coasts, others buried quickly and sealed in mud where time transformed them into fossils. The chemistry of those deposits tells us of worlds long gone. Carbon isotopes reveal drought or plenty. Oxygen isotopes whisper of warmer or cooler climates. Little by little, rivers gathered every voice of the land around them and carried it forward, past human memory, into the deep archive of geology. But rivers were not only scientists' records. To walk alongside one, had we the chance, would have filled the senses differently. The sound of water striking stone, the cool persistence of mist clinging to the edges, the sight of migrating herds scattering dust as they gathered to drink. The river mirrored the skies above, shifting in color as clouds drifted or storms darkened the horizon. Everything around it lived in relationship to its presence. In drought, its absence dictated migrations. In flood, its overwhelming strength broke old paths, forged new ones, reshaped entire valleys. What seemed like constancy was, in truth, a life of endless adjustment. Perhaps this is what makes rivers feel eternal. They appear unchanged when seen for a single lifetime, though they are always imperceptibly reshaping themselves with every hour. Some rivers carved through volcanic landscapes, pulling ash into fertile soil. Others wandered lazily through low plains, looping and folding upon themselves in meandering arcs that told of long patience. Their character was inseparable from what surrounded them. They inherited minerals from their mountains, sediments from their cliffs, and the faint signatures of plants that reached toward their shores. Over millions of years, river systems themselves would vanish, replaced by deserts, buried under tectonic uplift, or preserved as stone ridges in places no water runs now. In that sense, to follow a river is to follow impermanence, the understanding that what flows loudly today might be silenced tomorrow. And yet, this impermanence is not loss. The memory persists, replayed in layers of hardened mud, in isotopic histories etched into sand grains, in fossils half hidden where banks used to bend. Rivers teach us that memory can be both fleeting and eternal at once. Fleeting in the moment when water passes between our fingers, eternal in the way that moment leaves a mark written into stone. Perhaps that is why rivers feel so familiar, even though most of us never walk the length of one. They remind us that every life, every fragment, is part of something carried onward, even if the whole destination can never be seen. And as the plains of Pangea surrendered their soil into rivers, as herds came to drink and predators lingered at the edges, another rhythm, more violent and less patient, was waiting. For in the distance, beyond valleys and estuaries, volcanoes stirred, prepared to send fire into the skies above. When Pangea breathed fire, it did so without warning, though its heartbeat had been restless for millennia. The ground swelled, fissures split wide, and suddenly the skies themselves were consumed. Volcanoes erupted across the supercontinent, their plumes rising into the atmosphere with a force that turned day into night. Ash drifted outward, layer upon layer, veiling the land beneath a dim, shifting light. Forests that hours earlier teemed with sound were muted beneath a thick blanket of falling dust. Grasslands vanished under gray snow, rivers clotted with debris, and for a time, whole ecosystems seemed to pause beneath a sky that no longer offered comfort. To imagine this is to feel the scale of eruption not as disaster, but as transformation. The soil that lay blackened would, in time, grow fertile. Volcanic ash, though deadly in the moment, carried minerals, potassium, phosphorus, trace elements, that would later enrich new generations of plants. Some forests perished, their trunks charred where the heat reached them. Others survived by retreat, dispersing seeds that would only awaken long after the air cleared. The cycle was violence turning quietly into abundance, chaos folding back into renewal. What felt like an end was, in the language of deep time, merely transition. Geology preserves these eruptions with vivid precision. Charred layers of ancient soil remain, their chemical fingerprints distinct, revealing the moments when skies darkened and climates tilted. Volcanic rock records magnetic fields, frozen in alignment with poles that long since wandered. Isotopes locked into these layers tell of oceans shifted by carbon dispersals, of atmospheric changes that stretched far beyond the regions of fire. The story is not just one of eruption but of balance, a planet processing its inner heat, cycling what was buried back into air and stone. To stand beneath such skies would have been to experience something nearly cosmic. The horizon glowed with deep crimson at dusk, ash scattering sunlight into strange hues. Darkness deepened too early, stars appearing faint and blurred behind shifting clouds of sulfurous particles. Animals moved without understanding, their migrations interrupted, their instincts disoriented. Herds fled but found nowhere untouched. Predators waited, not because ash gave them advantage, but because the weak stumbled. Yet even they felt the strain, lungs filling with fine grains invisible to the eye, each breath a reminder that survival sometimes rests not on strength, but on luck. And as days turned into weeks, the ash settled. Rivers carried it downstream, embedding it into sediment. Floodplains entombed it, layering memory into soil. Time transformed what was once choking, burning, devastating into a delicate marker. A thin band of material now studied by paleontologists and geologists alike. Each eruption became a reference point, a horizon within stone, linking fossils above and below to specific ages. The violence of hours became the guidepost of millions of years. From this we understand that even destruction is a form of record-keeping. But eruptions did more than leave layers, they pressed change into the climate itself. Gases surged into the stratosphere, cooling some regions by veiling them against the sun, while warming others through carbon release. Monsoons shifted, deserts expanded, coastlines transformed. Species adapted quickly or stepped silently into extinction. To live through such times meant inhabiting a world of flux, never certain whether tomorrow would be familiar or entirely unrecognizable. Perhaps this is what bound all life on Pangea, the necessity of resilience, the quiet acceptance that nothing endures unchanged. Philosophy lingers here as well. What does it mean that the Earth's greatest devastations are also its tools of renewal? That out of burning forests come fertile soils? That from lingering ash rise future ecosystems? Perhaps entropy is not only decay, but rearrangement. What ends as ruin returns as foundation. In that sense, eruption is not calamity, but continuity, another verse in the long song of planetary memory. If we were to pause here, in the silence after fire, we'd notice how still everything becomes. The giants of the plains subdued, forests hushed, rivers slower with ash. The world seemed fragile, resting under a gray veil as if suspended between endings and beginnings. And yet, deep beneath the cooled crust, the mantle surged and shifted, the tectonic heartbeat continuing its silent work. Volcanoes reminded Pangea that nothing above was fixed, that all landscapes were temporary sceneries in a story written in lava and ash. Even now, when we examine ancient soils, we uncover their blackened layers, brittle as paper, reminders of when all was veiled and remade. They whisper across time not only of destruction, but of endurance. For every layer of ash is also a promise, that life will return, that memory will continue, that even the fiercest fire cannot silence the earth for long. And yet, as skies cleared and ash settled, life was not returning to what was, but to something different. If the climate itself could be rewritten in a season, then what other transformations, slower and wider, must have shaped the whole of Pangea? Pangea did not breathe as we do, with lungs of air, but with cycles of climate that stretched across its entire body. Seasons came not only as shifts of warmth and cold within a single year, but as vast oscillations of ice and drought, of rain and stillness, extended across millennia. The supercontinent was alive in this sense, a slow respiration of Earth itself, inhaling glaciers at one edge, exhaling monsoons at another, carrying every living thing along with its rhythm. To exist here was to dwell within an atmosphere that was not static but restless, never fully predictable, never entirely secure. In the far south of Pangea, ice crept across the land in advancing whispers, grinding stone into flour as it moved. Glacial sheets carved valleys and left scars that could still be traced long after they melted back. These frozen breaths were patient. They advanced over generations of creatures, pressing habitats into silence, then retreating in equal silence, leaving behind open plains where rivers began again. And while ice shaped the southern edges, the tropics lived in an opposite rhythm, one of abundance and flood. Here, monsoon currents stirred the atmosphere, bringing seasonal torrents that turned dry valleys into roaring rivers and transformed the plains into ephemeral wetlands alive with sudden growth. Between those extremes lay the interior of Pangea, far from the balance of coastal rains, where climates shifted into severe unpredictability. Some years brought hot winds and endless drought, the grasslands cracking open beneath a sun too heavy to bear. Other times, water surged in, carving new lakes, filling basins, leaving behind layers of silt and clay that geologists now study for their isotope secrets. Within those sediments is the cadence of these rhythms. Carbon isotopes recording whether plants drew nourishment in abundance or scarcity, oxygen isotopes revealing temperature swings and vanished storms. The rocks themselves became an archive of pulses that no creature could have fully recognized. Yet all were bound to obey. Life adapted as best it could. Giants of the plains migrated in tempo with rains, their travels written into the isotopic signatures of their teeth. In southern habitats, some creatures survived by trailing the edges of glaciers, nibbling at fragile plant life that took root in cold valleys, while others disappeared into extinction, unable to match the sudden harshness of ice. Along the tropics, hatchlings and herds lived at the mercy of violent floods that could wash away nests, bones, and whole generations in an evening. And still, from one cycle to the next, something always endured. Life does not resist change so much as it bends to its rhythm. And here on the gathered land of Pangea, every heartbeat of climate pressed its will upon the great tapestry of existence. To stand in this world would have been to feel the air itself as a shifting presence. The dry northern winds could strip the land of sound, carrying dust across entire stretches of plain until the horizon blurred into pale haze. The heavy southern storms rumbled with thunder that lingered for hours, rains pouring hard enough to carve stone. Some regions would have seemed eternal in their harshness, only to change abruptly over centuries into hospitable ground. And though these shifts seem so vast in retrospect, to creatures living within them, they must have felt both ordinary and absolute, ordinary as the turning of a season, absolute as life and death. If geology offers evidence, philosophy extends us questions. If the climate of Pangea could swing between frozen silence and flooding abundance in rhythms paced by deep time, what does that say about stability? Perhaps there is no permanence in temperature, in rainfall, in the conditions we call home. Perhaps all life is built upon moving ground, adapting in increments too small to notice until one day what was familiar becomes unrecognizable. Could it be that climate itself is the first teacher of impermanence, reminding us constantly that the only constant is transformation? And yet, we find ourselves comforted that these records endure. When scientists drill cores into ancient deposits, when they trace the chemistry of shells or the breath of long-buried soils, they retrieve the memory of storms no one lived to witness, of droughts that shaped the rise and fall of entire ecosystems. In its cycles, the past reveals itself not as chaos, but as pattern, as if the planet's memory is less a straight story and more a repeating breath. Cool, warm, dry, wet. Abundance, absence, renewal, loss. Always recurring, never identical, yet always familiar. To live in those climates was to surrender to rhythm. And perhaps that is what draws us into awe as we look back. Not only the extremes of drought and storm, but the realization that life carried on through them. The forest regrew after floods. Grass rose after drought. Ice retreated and valleys filled once more with sound. Climates shifted, and in their motion, they etched memory not just into stone, but into bone, into seed, into feather and scale. The rhythm of the earth was larger than any species, and yet every species bore its imprint. And as climates across Pangea inhaled and exhaled, pushing creatures into migrations, extinctions, rebirths, they left behind records visible even now. We see their trace in sediments, fossils, isotopes, a chorus of ancient breath. And yet, if climate could transform entire continents, forcing survival to bend and rebend, what of the creatures themselves pressed into stone? What stories do their fossils hold of memory even deeper than the climates that shaped them? When bodies fell on the soils of Pangea, they did not always vanish into silence. Some returned to the cycle of scavengers, their bones splintered, their flesh drawn back into insects and earth. Others dissolved into rivers, carried downstream to become fragments indistinguishable from the sediment itself. But a few, a very rare few, began another kind of journey, one in which their flesh was erased, but their forms were remembered. These were the bodies that fossilized, captured by chance and preserved as archives in stone. To see a fossil today is not only to see an animal long extinct, but to glimpse the most delicate of accidents, where life, memory, and geology intertwined. Fossilization begins with burial, and burial begins with time's quiet interventions. A river floods across a plain, sealing bones quickly in silt that cuts off the air. Volcanic ash smothers a herd, covering them in a layer that becomes stone while the bodies within harden in shadow. Or perhaps gentle sediment stacks gradually, millimeter by millimeter, until what was once a living creature is held beneath pressure, isolated from decay. Over years, minerals seep in, replacing bone with stone until the body is no longer body at all, but the idea of one crystallized and silent. What began as living tissue becomes a kind of sculpture carved not by hand but by earth itself. Science tells us that this process is astonishingly rare. For every million bodies that fell, only a handful endured into fossil record. The soil needed to be right, the chemistry aligned, the pressures precise. What is left to us, then, is not a complete chorus of the past but a scattering of whispers, selected not by intention but by circumstance. Yet these fragments, fragile and incomplete, speak with a presence stronger than their scarcity. A single bone, locked in sandstone, allows us to hear the outline of a life tens of millions of years gone. A shell spiral, mineralized into red rock, places us back at the edge of an ancient lagoon. Fossils are not the past in entirety, they are the echoes that survived forgetting. Philosophically, fossils remind us of what memory is. Not perfect recall, but pieces. Like our own recollections, the record of life is structured by what is kept and what is lost. Fossils are silent witnesses not because they speak, but because they endure, because they stand while so much else has collapsed into oblivion. They remind us that the body itself is temporary, endlessly vulnerable to the forces of entropy. Flesh decays, bone collapses, entire lineages leave no trace at all. And yet, improbably, here and there, the planet decides to remember. Consider that within fossilized bone lies more than shape. Isotopes preserved in the crystalline lattice reveal what the animal ate, what climate it endured, whether it migrated with the rains or lingered in lush valleys. These chemical traces, read today through careful instruments, are memory at the most elemental level. We see drought and abundance recorded not in written archives, but in oxygen ratios drawn into tooth enamel. We see environmental changes mirrored in shifts of carbon signatures. Every fossil is not just a replica of life, it is parchment, text, memory sealed in matter. And perhaps there is humility in this thought. that memory is not solely the realm of consciousness, that the earth remembers through its own processes, unconcerned with our need for stories. Fossils bear witness without intention, silent and patient, unread for epochs until uncovered by careful hands. They remind us that memory can outlast the very thing it remembers, that the body can disappear while its impression speaks still across time. Imagine standing before a fossil fragment in stone, perhaps a tooth, dulled by pressure, perhaps the curve of a rib pressed into sediment. What you hold is not the animal itself. It does not breathe, does not move, does not whisper. And yet, within it, something speaks. Of a climate dried into dust, of grasses once grazed, of migrations undertaken. It is, at once, entirely mute and impossibly eloquent. Fossils occupy this paradox, the silence that nonetheless tells everything. And across Pangea, fossils gathered in layers like punctuation marks within stone, recording bursts of abundance and long pauses of extinction. Studying them today, we glimpse a portrait that is incomplete but haunting. We see not only what lived, but what vanished. We see not only what survived, but what could not. Fossils, like memory, hold both presence and absence in equal measure. And yet, if the earth remembers through fossils, does it also forget? For every bone preserved, countless others are missing. For every record written, another decayed unscribed. Perhaps forgetting is part of memory, too, the silence essential to the shape of the story. After all, where fossils leave gaps, imagination persists, filling voids with questions we cannot yet answer. So we rest with the fossils, anchors of time, silent witnesses carved from chance. They remind us of the impermanence of flesh, the resilience of memory, and the balance between what is preserved and what must disappear. And yet, if even stone bodies can endure, what about the less visible traces, the entropy itself, the unseen whispers of decay? Could memory stretch into silence far beyond the reach of fossils, deeper even than the bones they leave behind? Even the largest bodies, the titans of Pangea who once thundered across plains and stood taller than trees, could not resist the slow unraveling. Entropy reached them as surely as it reached the smallest insect or the frailest leaf. Tooth by tooth, bone by bone, their immense forms surrendered to forces too subtle to see but too relentless to stop. The forest that sheltered them met the same fate. With splintered, bark fell into mulch, trunks collapsed into soil. Over time, everything yielded. Even giants decay. Entropy is not destruction in the ordinary sense. It is transformation, the slow reordering of matter from structure to dispersal. A perfect jaw begins to chip, enamel crumbles to dust, marrow dissolves into the pores of stone. The forests that towered dark and steady lose shape, their carbon sinking deeper into sediments, some eventually buried into coal seams, others fading as invisible trace gases into the atmosphere. Nothing resists entirely. Even rivers that cut through stone, even mountains that stretch toward the sky, eventually bow to entropy. It is not malice. It is simply inevitability. Science records entropy not as poetry, but as probability. A fossilized bone that survives is the rare exception, outlasting the endless tide of decay. Most bodies break down almost instantly, recycled through teeth and scavengers and bacteria. A handful slip past this collapse, entombed by chance, mineralized and hardened into memory. Even these fossils, though stone, are not immune. Minerals fracture, moisture seeps in, crystals expand and crack. Time continues its work. Entropy follows every form forward, erasing sharpness, blurring edges, scattering certainty across billions of years. And yet, if entropy ensures that all things vanish, it also ensures that nothing truly disappears. Matter, once broken apart, is never lost to the void. The calcium of a shattered bone may turn to chalk bedrock. The carbon of a fallen titan may drift into the lungs of generations further down the line. What was once life becomes dust, what was once dust becomes stone, what was stone might one day erode back into sea. Entropy is not so much an eraser as a disperser, folding memory into forms we can scarcely recognize. If fossils are the rare survivors of memory, then entropy is the chorus that surrounds them, the silence against which their endurance stands out. It is the reminder that most of the world's stories cannot be read, that most lives are not inscribed. Perhaps this is why fossils speak so strongly, because they are exceptions. Their survival is not expected, yet within their form lies proof of a defiance, a kind of pause in the endless drift of decay. They awaken us to the fragility of remembrance. To imagine entropy is to imagine time's widest embrace. Every pattern degrades, every structure breaks, not because time seeks to undo, but because motion spreads. Heat disperses, energy thins, forms collapse into simpler states. What was once vivid becomes faded, not with cruelty, but with the patience of inevitability. Maybe this is what memory itself struggles against: entropy's drift, the dispersal of detail, the erosion of clarity. We remember less as time moves, not because the memory hates us, but because forgetting is built into the universe's design. And yet, entropy leaves echoes. The giants who once lived are gone, but their bones, shattered or preserved, still travel through our imagination. The forests long burned or buried still give us coal, oil, hints of pollen caught in rock. Even the absence becomes presence, the gap in the fossil record producing questions, questions producing wonder. Entropy shapes not only what remains but what we seek, guiding our curiosity through silences as much as through stone. Perhaps this is the strange gift within decay, that to lose is also to invite searching, that the silence of what is gone sharpens attention to what endures. Maybe entropy is not only the breaking but also the space in which wonder grows. Because when we bend over an ancient fossil, chipped and incomplete, we do not simply see what survived. We also see what was lost, what entropy reclaimed, what the earth itself has chosen to fold back into the cycle. And as we return from this thought, the air grows quiet again. Forests crumble, bones fracture, memories scatter into minerals and dust. And yet, if entropy hums beneath all things, dispersing life into silence, what might it mean for extinction itself, when entire species fall into those echoes and only the faintest trace lies waiting to be found? Extinction rarely announces itself with a sudden cry. More often it comes as a slow exhale, a steady narrowing of possibilities until life finds itself unable to continue. In the wide expanse of Pangea, where forests once stretched beyond vision and plains rippled with migrating giants, this breath of extinction moved quietly across ages. Habitat shifted, climate swung from abundance to drought, and creatures that had endured for millions of years found themselves cornered by change. Their voices fell silent, one by one, leaving only traces etched into the rocks, fragments for us to discover long after the last breath had dissolved into air. What does it mean to witness extinction not as catastrophe, but as rhythm? Paleontology whispers that disappearances were not uncommon in Pangea. Species rose, flourished, then vanished, shaped by climate cycles and tectonic change. Rivers shifted their courses, deserts expanded, coastlines drowned beneath rising seas or withdrew beneath advancing ones. Each change forced adjustments, but not all creatures could bend. For some, the range of adaptation ran out. For others, competition pushed them from the center into the margins, until even the margins dissolved. Extinction was not a single event. It was 1,000 small decisions written not by choice but by chance, until whole lineages found themselves drifting into silence. The geological record holds proof of these vanishings, though always incomplete. A layer without certain fossils that had been present beneath. A sudden change in isotope ratios, suggesting climates altered beyond recognition. Charred traces of forests burned in drought, implying homes lost and food webs broken. Sometimes extinction is written as absence, a gap. Other times it is present in overabundance, too much volcanic ash, too much carbon dioxide, too much dryness spread across once fertile regions. In stone, we find not the animals themselves, but the evidence of what forced them to fade. And yet, extinction also preserves. The very conditions that bring loss can entomb memory. Many fossils we uncover today are the remains of the fallen, preserved not in spite of the disaster, but because of it. Ashfall sealed skeletons beneath blankets of fine dust. River sediments pressed bones into hardened strata, as if time itself was determined to hold onto their likeness. Extinction erases in the living world, but in doing so, it sometimes leaves archives deeper than survival would. Those who vanish leave messages unintentionally, silent but enduring. There is philosophy in this, a kind of haunting humility. If extinction is as natural to the planet as rain or tectonic drift, then every species carries the breath of its own ending within it. Nothing is spared. The forests that fell, the giants that grazed them, even the predators that waited in dust eventually reached a threshold they could not cross. Extinction is not failure. It is a kind of punctuation in Earth's memory, an interruption that makes room for something else. But still, there is sorrow here even if unnoticed at the time. The last breath of a species is never recorded by contemporaries. It passes quietly, without ceremony, entering air that gives no sign it was ever marked. It is only millions of years later, in our study, that patterns become visible and absence begins to carry weight. But perhaps extinction also carries a question for us. If entire lineages can vanish without remembrance, what does it mean for us to live briefly in such a system? What gives permanence to our presence, when even the mightiest beasts could be erased until only shards of bone remain? Could it be that extinction is not oblivion but memory written differently, a migration from sound to silence, from flesh to fossil, from song to chemistry in stone? Each vanished species lives on not in continuity, but in the ripple felt across ecosystems, the shifts recorded in soil chemistry, the voids that make space for others. Their absence is memory, too, though quieter than their presence. Imagine, if we could, standing at the moment of one such disappearance. Perhaps the last of a small reptile scurries beneath a dry bush, unable to find water in a drought that lasts too many seasons. Around it, life continues. Larger animals graze, birds call, winds scrape across stone. The passing makes no sound beyond the ordinary. And yet, in retrospect, we know it was the end of a lineage that survived millions of years until that instant. In such a moment, extinction is less about drama than about stillness, the breath leaving with no return. And across Pangea, this happened again and again. Entire branches of life contracted into nothingness, leaving silence that stretched into the future. We, in our present, look back and call them forgotten. But perhaps they were not forgotten at all. Perhaps their memory lies in the soil beneath us, the isotopic whispers in fossil records, the empty spaces where once there was form. Perhaps extinction is not erasure, but transformation of presence into something subtler. And yet, if the breath of extinction shaped Pangea with such quiet inevitability, what of the small ones who endured in the background? What of the hidden mammals in the shadows? The fragile survivors who threaded their lineages through catastrophe and silence alike. In the shadow of titans, where colossal reptiles thundered across plains and predators watched from dusty ridges, there moved smaller lives, nearly invisible, almost forgotten, yet essential. These were the early mammals, small furred creatures that scurried through undergrowth, hid in the darkness of burrows, or threaded carefully along the margins of forests. Their bodies were fragile compared to the armored or towering forms that ruled the surface world. And yet they survived. Survival for them was not spectacle, but subtlety. It was persistence written in silence. Their size was their shield. While giants bent the land with their footsteps, mammals vanished beneath it, digging systems of tunnels where the air was cooler and the dangers fewer. Roots laced their walls, insects seeped downward, moisture clung to clay. Here they lived unseen, storing seeds, nursing their young, waiting for the larger world to pass above them. Some emerged at night, their senses sharpened in the quiet hours when the herd slept and predators were less active. To be small meant living in the in-between, invisible to the eyes of many, overlooked by history until their lineages revealed themselves later as something quieter but just as transformative. The fossil record of these early mammals is faint. Jaw fragments, worn teeth, hints of delicate bones preserved by accident. They do not dominate the layers of stone as dinosaurs and giant reptiles do, but appear like whispers, fragments of continuity amid the louder remains. And yet those fragments tell us much. Their teeth, with cusps shaped not for leaves alone but for insects, seeds, and small vertebrates, reveal a diet of adaptability. The isotopes in enamel suggest opportunism, feeding wherever the landscape allowed. In their biology we see not dominance but flexibility, the ability to thrive in shortage, to endure where abundance faltered. It is tempting to overlook them among the grandeur of Pangea's megafauna, but perhaps it is precisely their modesty that gave them resilience. Large bodies required vast amounts of food and water. They were tied to favorable climates, vulnerable when rivers twisted course or when droughts spread further than expected. The small mammals, by contrast, could survive on little. A handful of seeds, an insect caught beneath bark, moisture drawn slowly from roots. Entire lineages of giants rose and fell in the light of the open plains, while mammals slipped quietly through the centuries underground, unnoticed yet unbroken. And in their shadows lies philosophy. Could it be that strength is not always found in scale but in persistence? That survival prefers flexibility to force? The mammals remind us that history is not written only by the loudest presences but also by those who endure long enough to inherit silence. When catastrophe came, when climates swayed, when extinctions pressed across ecosystems, the small ones endured simply because their fragility disguised resilience. Imagine standing in Pangea's night, the plains silent after the day's migrations, the air cooler, stars wide above. In the brush, soft movements begin. Tiny paws on dry leaves, whiskers brushing the stems of ferns, quiet chirps exchanged between hidden companions. They are not meant to command awe. They do not tower, they do not roar. But their presence adds another dimension to the continent's rhythm. They carry futures in their tiny forms, futures neither predators nor giants could have imagined. From them, lineages would one day spread into every niche, filling gaps left behind by creatures seemingly eternal. And so the legacy of Pangea's mammals is not invisibility, but persistence. They remind us that life endures not only through grandeur but also through modest forms that slip between catastrophe's reach. Their fossils are rare, but their importance echoes. For what they preserved was not dominance of the present, but possibility. A continuity of breath that would, in ages far beyond Pangea, reshape the surface of the earth itself. And yet, if those small shadows could hold the seed of futures unimaginable, what of the even smaller forces, the insects, whose labor stitched together the soil, the forests, and the very breath of the supercontinent? Long before the silence of extinction reached the giants, long before bones settled into stone, the smallest engineers were already at work. Insects, fragile, tireless, often unnoticed, were the unseen architects of Pangea's ecosystems. While the giants roamed and the forests stretched skyward, it was the flutter of wings, the burrow of beetles, the slow work of decay that shaped the very ground beneath them. A continent lived not only by its largest beings, but also by its smallest. Pollination tied the forests together. Early insects, visiting cones and primitive flowering plants to be, carried tiny grains of pollen from one root system to the next. These transfers were delicate gestures, invisible to giants, but within them entire lineages of trees and ferns found the breath of continuity. Without insects, the forests would have struggled to reproduce at such scales. Their reach limited, their genetic diversity narrowed. With them, every gust of colorless wings painted resilience into the vegetation. The forests, immense as they seemed, were both maintained and sustained by creatures no larger than a thumbprint. On the ground, the soil told another story of insect labor. Termite-like ancestors tunneled through wood, fragmenting fallen trunks into digestible debris, while beetles churned through leaf litter, folding dead matter back into the earth. This simple act, eating, breaking down, recycling, was fundamental. Nutrients returned again and again into circulation, feeding roots, feeding grasses, sustaining life from the ground upward. Without insects, layers of decay would have smothered new growth. With them, decomposition became rhythm, a steady recycling that ensured life could flourish endlessly, no matter how much the forests shed. And in death, insects carried the memory of endings forward. Carcasses left behind by great herbivores were stripped clean by swarms of scavengers. Bones left bare where soft tissue had been. In hours, matter returned to soil. In days, to cycles of energy passed from body to body. Insects were not only recyclers of decay, they were meticulous archivists, redistributing life into smaller forms, ensuring nothing was wasted. Though the giants might have ruled by sight, by scale, insects ruled by process, their work shaping ecosystems from beneath, invisible and uninterrupted. The fossil record captures these truths in small but telling ways. Amber droplets preserve delicate insect wings, arrested mid-beat in golden stillness. Trace fossils reveal patterns of tunneling through wood, marks of jaws long vanished but still recognizable. Even the chemistry of ancient soils, enriched by decayed matter, points toward a history of cycle and return sustained by insect activity. Though their bodies are rarely preserved compared to bones of reptiles and mammals, their impact is written quietly across every corner of Pangea's sedimentary pages. There is humility in this story of scale. Humans, like those long-vanished giants, are drawn to what towers, to what thunders across landscapes. But enduring life has always depended more on what is small, resilient, and often hidden. Insects do not demand the sky or the broad plains. They do not carve mountain ranges or alter climates through weight alone. Instead, they persist by interconnection, by precise effort multiplied across unimaginable numbers. Their importance lies not in spectacle, but in continuity. And perhaps there is philosophy in their persistence. Could it be that significance is not measured by size, but by contribution to the whole? That true shaping power comes not from towering might, but from the quiet, continuous work of countless small beings? If Pangea teaches us anything, it may be that the destiny of continents was guided as much by the brush of translucent wings as by the march of reptiles large enough to bend trees. The insects remind us that memory, too, is cumulative. No single act stands alone. Each pollen grain transferred, each carcass cycle begun, each root nourished is a thread in the fabric of time. And though their lives were fleeting days, weeks at most, their efforts stretched across ages, stitching ecosystems into stability. Giants rose and fell, forests burned and regrew, climates shifted endlessly, but insects endured, never withdrawing their labor, never ceasing their work. And yet, if the smallest beings could reshape whole continents so quietly, what of those who mastered the skies, tracing invisible highways above forests and deserts, dwelling where air itself became both boundary and home? Above Pangea's plains and forests, another world unfolded, silent highways, stretching across currents invisible to the ground below. Along these pathways traveled the pterosaurs, creatures whose delicate wings carried them further than feet could ever wander. They were moving shadows against ancient skies, their silhouettes crossing rivers, deserts, and coastlines as easily as the winds that bore them. To imagine them is to imagine the sky itself alive, written not with passing clouds but with beings who learned the art of gliding before mammals or birds had even taken their first fragile steps toward air. Pterosaurs were more than flyers. They were interpreters of the atmosphere, aligning themselves with subtle rises of warm air, drifting within spirals of thermals born from volcanic heat or from plains still baking beneath midday sun. Where mountains rose, they redirected winds, and the pterosaurs read these signals with instinctual precision. Migration followed such currents, journeys that carried them over thousands of kilometers, unseen lines traced and retraced across sky maps that no human eye would ever see. To watch them would have been to sense both fragility and grace, bodies slender, wings thin as membranes of parchment, yet enduring because they surrendered to air rather than fought against it. Science tells us pterosaurs ranged in scale from the size of small birds to wingspans greater than any creature before or since. Their bones were light, hollow, fragile in sleep but perfectly suited for the endless lift and drift of air. Where giants of the plains bore their weight against the earth, pterosaurs gave in to physics differently, trading heaviness for harmony. Fossils reveal their delicate structures, fragile bones more common to shatter than preserve. Yet within those rare finds we read the memory of sky creatures who mastered balance long before balance was a human pursuit. They knew resilience not through magnitude, but through precision. Imagine standing on a vast shoreline of Pangea at dusk. The air cools, thermal currents shift, and above the fading horizon, pterosaurs wheel in quiet arcs. Their wings catch last light, glowing faintly as though sky itself has granted them passage. They do not speak loudly, their cries faint against distance, but their presence is unmistakable. The land below pays them no attention. Herds graze, predators crouch in dust, insects work tirelessly among reeds. Yet above, unseen by many, air becomes a canvas for persistence. Maybe this is why their lives seem so dreamlike to us now. Air is harder to fossilize. Their memory is scattered, not in endless bones but in suggestions of where they must have been, in sediments left by coastal rookeries, in bones hardened against chance. Their role in Pangea's ecosystems was subtle and necessary. Feeding from fish near the coasts, scavenging carcasses left on plains. Some even adapted to forage inland, chasing insects or small vertebrates carried up through rising swarms. They transported nutrients as they moved, spreading life between inland and sea, sky and ground. They were part of exchange itself, connecting ecosystems that otherwise seemed separate. The dust of volcanoes, the cooling wind from glaciers, the warming currents along equatorial lines, each influenced their paths. And so their survival, like all creatures of their age, was not separate from climate but bound tightly to its tempo. There is poetry in this, that to fly is not to escape Earth, but to be more tethered to its moods. Flight looks like freedom, but in truth it is utter surrender, to thermals, to wind shear, to the slightest change in direction of currents. Pterosaurs remind us that resilience does not mean control. It means listening to forces larger than oneself. Even as giants stalked the forests and plains, even as oceans pushed against Pangea's edges, the sky travelers were part of that same heartbeat, their migrations written in the physics of air. Some fossils hint at their colonies, nested along cliffs or shores, fragile eggs buried in soft sands. Imagine them waiting for hatching, exposed to storms, to tides, to shifts in climate that might erase an entire generation in a single season. Yet they returned again and again for millions of years. Their persistence stretched across ages in which other lineages faltered. That is the quiet triumph of the sky travelers. Not invincibility, but enduring presence. Perhaps we find wonder in them because they embody something we long for. The ability to move without weight, to live carried by invisible lines, to trace the horizon without being bound by it. They remind us that life rises not only from soil and water, but also from air, where memory takes form not in stone, but in fleeting shapes slipping across the sun. And yet, if shadows could claim the sky for millions of years, what might have stirred in the seas carved within Pangea, where whole other realms of memory and movement thrived unseen beneath shifting tides? If Pangea seemed solid and unbroken on its vast surface, its heart held secrets of shifting tides and hidden depths. Inland seas, shallow but expansive, spread like mirrors across the megacontinent. They were not oceans in the way we imagine today, endless and deep, but vast interior waters cradled within the supercontinent's folds. Here, ecosystems flourished, entire worlds floating within quiet basins, cut off from the greater panthalassic expanse. To drift upon their surface would have felt like inhabiting a sky turned downward, horizons blending into soft light, shorelines faint and distant, life moving beneath with rhythms older than any forest or plain. Within these seas, ammonites spiraled in endless patterns, their coiled shells glinting faintly in refracted light. They were guardians of deep time, carrying their geometry across ages, recording environmental changes in the chemistry of each growth ring. Alongside them swam shoals of early fish, silver flashes darting like scattered stars. Larger reptiles patrolled above and below, their forms sleek and powerful, ruling these strange kingdoms of inland water. To watch such a scene would be to glimpse an entirely different Pangea, one not of dust and earth, but of liquid silence, where survival depended not on migrations across plains but on currents, tides, and the subtle chemistry of confined seas. Science reveals their presence in fossilized sediments, in limestone deposits that once settled as mud on shallow seabeds. Layers reveal ripple marks, traces of ancient tide movements, and the imprints of shells pressed flat into stone. Even more delicate, isotopic records from the shells themselves whisper of fluctuating salinity, of hotter intervals when evaporation concentrated lakes into salty basins, of cooler ages when rainfall replenished fresher cycles. These details tell us the seas were not static. They breathed like the land around them, expanding, contracting, shifting quietly as climates altered their shape. What lived within them was bound to these quiet pulses, dependent on balance as fragile as breath. And yet, while precarious, they were abundant. Ammonites filled niches in dazzling diversity, evolving new forms and ornaments on their shells, each spiral marking not just survival, but adaptation. Fish developed strategies to thrive in waters that sometimes grew shallow or warm. Marine reptiles spread into these inland habitats, their movements elegant arcs across ecosystems isolated from broader oceans. To exist here was to partake in a cycle of uncertainty, and yet to endure for millions of years. These seas remind us that even isolation can be a cradle of resilience. To walk along these ancient shores would have been to feel both familiarity and strangeness. Waves lapping gently against sandbars, reeds lining calmer edges, their pollen drifting into the basin to settle as invisible records in mud. And yet the creatures surfacing before you would have had no modern equivalent, their eyes gleaming just above the surface, their bodies vanishing swiftly into the depths. You would sense that this water was not simply a resource, but a realm entirely its own, one where memory was written not on land, but in layers of sediment drifting quietly to the bottom. Philosophically, inland seas echo something deeper about memory and containment. Unlike the expansive oceans, their boundaries were finite, their resources limited, their patterns determined by confinement. Perhaps they are metaphors for ourselves, life growing within boundaries larger than we can cross, yet forever shaped by limits beyond our control. The ammonites did not need to know the wider Panthalassa. Their spiral shells carried universes within them, their survival already sufficient in enclosed cycles that would later vanish without warning. Could it be that we, too, inhabit seas we cannot perceive, our memories spiraling within unseen boundaries that will one day fade into stone? And extinction, inevitable as it was, passed through these seas as through plains and forests. Entire groups vanished when salinity tilted or temperatures shifted too far. Fossil beds reveal sudden die-offs. Layers thick with shells collapsed together, testimony of waters that could no longer sustain the abundance they once nurtured. Even in their silence, the seas tell of fragility. Yet in that fragility lies an unbroken truth, that each ecosystem, no matter how temporary, contributes a verse to Earth's memory. Today, when scientists split open limestone layers in regions far from any shoreline, they find the seas of Pangea sealed within. Inland areas now dry and arid pulse with evidence of marine abundance long vanished. Fossilized ammonites rest in coiled perfection, their intricate lines revealing both beauty and chemistry, each spiral an account of climates that shaped them. The seas we can no longer visit remain with us, not in water, but in stone, as if Earth refuses to forget what once moved across its surface. And so, when we think of Pangea's interior, let us not think only of deserts and plains, but of seas shimmering quietly within the bones of the land. Strange kingdoms of water where life thrived unseen, where ammonites spiraled, where fish shimmered, where reptiles slipped into liquid shadow. They remind us that the boundaries between land and sea were always blurred, and that memory is not held only in forests or fossils, but also in sediments on the floor of vanished waters. And yet, if seas within Pangea could hold such memory in stillness, what stories might we find in bones resting deep within the red stone where time itself hardened loss into permanence? Across the wide interior of Pangea, deserts and plains often gave way to a different kind of archive. Beds of stone that stretched for hundreds of miles, their hues deep with iron-rich dust. These were the red beds, ancient formations of sandstone and siltstone stained by the slow oxidation of iron in the soils. Their surfaces glowed beneath the sun, landscapes that appeared timeless. But within their layers they carried the quiet record of change, of drought, of life interrupted. Bones that once belonged to great animals now rested here, pressed into stone, becoming silent markers of eras when conditions pushed species toward disappearance. Sediment hardened into rock not quickly but gradually, through cycles of flood and dryness. Seasonal rains carved channels that carried silt from distant mountains, scattering it across low basins. Then came the droughts, pressing the sediments under arid skies, baking them into compact layers. Over millions of years, these cycles repeated, building enormous expanses of stone, red not from blood, but from oxygen, from the slow rusting of a world exposed to air. In their depths lie fossils, rare and fragile, yet enduring like whispers caught in mineral form. They reveal to us where rivers once flowed, where herds once grazed, and where storms once lay heavy above the horizon. Bones in these red beds tell of abrupt endings. Many belong to animals caught in floods, their bodies swept by sudden waters into river channels, then sealed beneath quick-draining sediments. Others were left behind in drought, carcasses collapsing onto cracked ground until wind carried soil across them, layering memory over silence. Once entombed, minerals seeped through them, pore by pore, replacing living tissue with stone until only form and essence remained. What they left behind are outlines of presence, bodies transformed into geological testimony, proof that once here, life walked, breathed, and faded into entropy. Geologists read these stones with patience, tracing the sequence of layers like chapters in an ancient book. Each band tells something different, some thick with grains from fast torrents, others fine and dusty from slow winds. Fossils pressed within these beds provide context. The curvature of a rib, a fragment of jaw, even impressions of plant life. Their positions within red layers mark the rhythm of catastrophe and renewal, reminding us that ecosystems never held permanence, that balance was interrupted by cycles of scarcity and flood. And yet, the red beds are not quiet only in their geology but in their mood. To stand in such a place today, reduced to desert in much of the world, is to feel a heavy silence. The landscapes seem stripped, as though their life has already been spent. But within that silence lies memory, stones whispering of ancient droughts, fossils murmuring of extinction, the presence of giants held not in movement but in stillness. The land no longer walks with creatures, but carries the imprint of their passing. This silence is not emptiness, it is testimony. Philosophically, the bones in red stone show us that death is not always absence. Sometimes it is transformation, a life pressed into a marker greater than itself. These fossils do not recount the details of daily existence. They do not remember the sound of footsteps or the rhythms of breath. Instead, they carry the essence of finitude, the fact that something was and then was no longer. In their quiet, they remind us of impermanence, but also of endurance. That even endings can leave residue strong enough to transcend millions of years. And maybe that is what draws us to fossils in red stone. Their stillness against the immensity of time. They show us not only the fragility of life but the resilience of memory when written in the language of minerals. A ribcage sealed in sandstone tells us that entropy has transformed, but not erased. Instead of dust blowing into nothingness, the dust condensed, hardened, and preserved a trace. Bones that once moved are now unmoving, yet still speak, silently, from within a continental canvas of scarlet rock. Imagine holding one of those fossils in your hand. It is not the animal, not truly, but it bears its weight across time. You feel both the loss and the persistence, the silence and the lingering memory. The stone is mute, yet somehow eloquent. It says only one thing: I was here. And to stand before such testimony is to realize that planetary silence is not without voice. Even absence leaves its echo. And yet, if bones and stone can whisper across hundreds of millions of years, what might we hear in the slower voices of ice, where glaciers carved their stories not into red deserts, but into the southern edges of the supercontinent itself. At the southern edges of Pangea, where the land bent toward colder latitudes, ice pressed against the continent like a hand of silence. Glaciers, vast and heavy, spread across valleys and mountain ridges, their movements so patient they seemed at first like stillness. Yet these rivers of frozen time were never still. They flowed with an imperceptible rhythm, grinding stone beneath their weight, carving memory into the bedrock 1 inch, 1 century at a time. It is difficult to imagine such immensity, yet every groove, every polished surface, tells us the ice once moved here. Glacial presence was both sculptor and destroyer. Enormous sheets advanced outward, dragging boulders, grinding mountains into flour-like dust, leaving behind striations that remain even today as scars along ancient rocks. When the climate shifted and the ice retreated, meltwater surged in torrents, carving channels, forming braided rivers, and flooding valleys that had been locked in cold silence for millennia. The land beneath Pangea's southern expanse was shaped repeatedly by this advance and withdrawal, each cycle etching new patterns of silence and thaw into the continent's memory. Even the animals who roamed nearby adapted to these rhythms, their migrations tethered to climates pulled by the glacial breath. Science allows us to trace these cycles through isotopes preserved in glacial sediments. Oxygen signatures within ancient rocks tell us when the climate leaned colder, when water was locked into frozen form, when monsoons weakened under shifting currents. Carbon dioxide, too, ebbed and surged, sealed within bubbles trapped in ice long before we walked here. These isotopic stories confirm that even during the Age of Giants, when reptiles and early mammals seemed unconquerable, larger cycles of ice whispered beneath, influencing ecosystems far from the glaciers themselves. Monsoons in the tropics weakened as ice advanced in the south. Deserts expanded and contracted in rhythm with glacial growth. The whole supercontinent breathed according to the silent authority of frozen time. And yet, despite their immensity, glaciers carried paradox. They destroyed, yes, but they also preserved. Beneath their weight, seeds and spores lay dormant, waiting for thaw to release them into fertile meltwater streams. Pollen trapped in sediment beneath the ice remains for scientists to find, revealing which plants lived at the margins of frozen fields. Even fossils reveal evidence of creatures stepping carefully near these ranges. Footprints pressed into mud that later hardened beneath glacial sediment, preserving a trace of life under the breath of cold. In disappearance, there was still memory, carved into both stone and soil. How would the world have felt during these times? Imagine storms rolling off glacial fronts, air chilled beyond comparison, winds carrying ice crystals that burned against the skin. Megafauna, adapted as they were to cycles of abundance in grasslands and forests, must have lingered closer to warmer regions when ice pressed outward. Perhaps only the hardiest ventured near the margins, foraging on tundra-like vegetation that bloomed briefly in short summers. Their endurance was tethered to patience, to knowing the difference between waiting and wandering. The glaciers reminded every creature, not only here, but across Pangea, that the earth dictated rhythm, and life had no choice but to bend. Philosophically, the glaciers embody the paradox of stillness that is never still. Their vastness appears eternal, yet their true power lies in motion invisible to the human eye. They seem to endure unchanged, and yet every breath of ice remakes the land beneath it. Perhaps memory itself is like this, appearing static, eternal, immutable, while underneath it shifts, cracks, and reforms with each passing moment. The ice, like time, cannot resist the pull to move forward, carving, erasing, and recording all at once. Today, geologists uncover these stories in striated rock, polished surfaces where glaciers scraped bedrock clean, layers of till where stones of all sizes were carried and dropped randomly as ice retreated. These are the frozen archives of southern Pangea, whispering of climates that swung between extremes, reminding us that the Age of Giants was never stable. Beneath the noise of life lay the great drumbeat of ice, a rhythm too slow for creatures to notice, but too strong for any to escape. And maybe this is the essential lesson of glaciers. Their silence is not a pause, but a voice. a whisper of impermanence, a reminder that even the mightiest ecosystems rested under cycles of change. Ice movement tells us that permanence is illusion, that even the hardest stone bows when time presses long enough. If we listen, glaciers murmur that the world is not fixed, but endlessly becoming. And yet, if glaciers at the edge of Pangea could reshape entire climates, what of the ancient migration paths across the continent's heart, where animals carried memory with their own footsteps, tracing corridors that stretched beyond horizons and into the forgotten dark of time? Across the vastness of Pangea, life did not remain still. Herds drifted across open plains, reptiles crossed valleys that no longer exist, and small mammals followed water that rose and vanished with the seasons. Migration was not a choice for many, but a necessity, a rhythm older than memory itself. Ancient corridors guided them, carved not by decision but by landscape. Valleys aligned with rivers, forests shadowed by mountain ranges, passes widened between deserts and grasslands. Each became a path where countless footsteps pressed into soil, connecting ecosystems in slow, repeating patterns. These paths are gone now, erased by time, but their memory lingers faintly in the fossils embedded in stone. To trace these forgotten migrations today is to piece together fragments of silence. Trackways found in hardened mudflats show herds moving in single direction, rows upon rows of imprints recorded in sedimentary pages. Fossil isotopes inside teeth reveal journeys across climate zones, chemical shifts preserved from foods eaten in different regions. Even the arrangement of bones in old floodplains reveals the movement of entire groups, creatures caught mid-journey when rising waters overwhelmed them. Each trace is a reminder that great distances were once crossed, that animals carried not only bodies but memory itself across an unsettled land. These lost corridors wove together the lifeblood of Pangea. Herbivores followed the rains, wavering between fertile regions and dry expanses depending on season. Predators shadowed them, their ranges extending not by choice but by necessity, survival bound to the steps of their prey. Even the smallest, hidden mammals watched the routes of the large, scavenging leftovers, imitating patterns, learning when abundance might pass through their territory. Such connections tied the supercontinent in invisible lines, a web of movement threading plains, deserts, and forests. The land was never purely divided. It was joined by migration, a form of memory expressed through repeated paths. And yet, those corridors are no longer visible. Uplift fractured mountain passes. Climate emptied valleys once filled with rivers. When Pangea itself divided, whole pathways were broken, their continuations scattered across continents. The trails that once carried giants across unified lands now lie underwater, or beneath deserts, or in mountains reconfigured by tectonic upheaval. To imagine them is to imagine threads cut but not erased, lines lingering faintly in stone, waiting for us to wonder. Where did those journeys end, and what remains of their steps? There is philosophy in this erasure. A migration corridor is a memory written in repetition. Each year, each generation, animals return along the same river, the same plain. The path becomes more than movement. It becomes continuity. But once the corridor dissolves, the memory fades. Species vanish, rivers dry, tectonic drift pulls the land apart. What was once a living pattern becomes absence. And yet, absence has its own voice. Fossilized trackways stand like signatures, echoes of movement that continue to speak long after the corridors themselves disappeared. In this sense, migration is part of Earth's archive, not only in the bones left behind, but in the spaces themselves. Soil enriched by countless herds fertilized regions for millennia. Vegetation patterns shifted where migrations concentrated, grazing shaping growth that fossilized into pollen records. Even today, by reading isotopes preserved in stromatolites, soils, or teeth, we uncover ghost maps of ancient corridors. These data do not tell us what each creature thought or felt, but they whisper of rhythms repeated across deep time. The earth remembers travel even if the travelers have been forgotten. And perhaps there is something within us drawn to these disappearances. We walk through landscapes littered with fragments of ancient paths, feeling the faint tug of routes once well-worn. Memory is not always about permanence. Sometimes it is about recognition that something once passed through here, something greater than us, carrying forward until it no longer could. Migration corridors are gone, but their essence is still here, stitched into sediment, quiet but enduring. Imagine standing on a present-day valley floor, where no giant now walks. The land appears still, but hidden within its stone are the echoes of countless footsteps pressed into mud and dried in sun. They remain in trace fossils, rows of imprints, some fading, some startlingly clear. These remnants tell us that the land itself has memory, not because it chooses, but because the physics of sediment and the persistence of stone ensure nothing is entirely lost. The lost corridors invite us to wonder, where did these journeys lead, and where do they lead still, if only invisibly? Perhaps their true destination was never a single place but the continuity of movement itself, the weaving of land into living networks across the face of the supercontinent. To think of them is to imagine life carried on invisible roads of dust and time, each step anchoring memory into the earth itself. And yet, if migrations left such enduring imprints across vanished valleys, what could we say of civilizations that never were? Of technofossils and hidden traces that might dream alongside natural archives, waiting to be uncovered in stone? Beneath the layers of Pangea's stone, where fossils hold the silence of vanished beasts, another thought drifts like smoke in the stillness. What if there were more? What if deep within the archives of red beds and inland seas lies not only the memory of forests and titans, but something stranger, artifacts of a civilization so old it has been dissolved into entropy's dust? Speculation is not evidence, but it is curiosity, and curiosity is a kind of patience. If a civilization had flourished on this supercontinent, long before ourselves, what would endure of it now? The geological record favors stone and bone, but it is deeply selective, offering us fragments already filtered by chance. Fossils of vast herds survive only because some were entombed quickly. Forests survive only because their pollen was pressed into sediment and their trunks mineralized into petrified monuments. If whole ecosystems leave such partial traces, what then of cities, if they ever arose and fell before ours? Would we expect to find concrete dissolved to dust, metal structures corroded into oxides, synthetic polymers degraded until indistinguishable from organic sediments? The earth, after all, is not forgiving of permanence, it recycles. Subduction tucks layers into molten mantle. Erosion grinds surfaces into anonymity. Even quiet air oxidizes and reclaims. Entropy is an archivist and an eraser both, deciding not through will but through inevitability. And yet, some things endure. Ancient volcanic glass holds chemistry intact for hundreds of millions of years. Zircon crystals preserve isotopic fingerprints older than any mountain range. Fossils of creatures far smaller than the eye can see remain etched into stone as though time itself conspired to remember. If human plastics, metals, or radioisotopes can survive in our age, transformed into what geologists call technofossils, could something similar have survived from an earlier beginning? Not identical, of course, the materials would differ, the constructions would be alien to us, but their entropy would follow the same rules. Rivers would bury, oceans would scatter, tectonics would drag entire landscapes downward. Only relics encased quickly and deeply might remain. And if they did, what would they look like to us now? Perhaps indistinguishable from mineral anomaly. Perhaps, somewhere, they already sit in drawers of geology collections, marked as unusual deposit, their origin unconsidered. This is not to say such a civilization exists in record, but to ask, how would we ever know? Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence when millions of years lie between us and possibility. Consider that humans have only lightly sampled the crust of the continents, have drilled into sediments but rarely across vastness, have studied fossils while still recognizing how patchwork these archives truly are. What if silence in the record leaves room not for certainty but for wonder? Not because we must fill it with myths, but because humility itself demands we accept that the archive of Earth is never complete. Philosophically, the hidden technofossil thought is not about proving forgotten civilizations. It is about asking what it means for any civilization to leave a trace at all. We wonder if some other intelligence might have walked Pangea, shaped tools, built upon stone, only to vanish into time's oblivion. Yet when we ask this, we are also asking about ourselves. If we were to vanish, what would survive us? Our tools may persist longer than our bodies, our buildings longer than our words, our isotopes longer than our stories. In the end, will our memory endure in libraries or in plastics hardened into future stone? Or will entropy strip us back to minerals and silence, a vanished age marked only by thin, ambiguous lines in geological strata? Imagine, for a moment, a quiet city on the edge of a Pangean inland sea, forged not in myths, but in curiosity. Stone walls softening into dust under rain, pigments scoured away, metal tarnishing into streaks, would reduce to carbon shadows. Entropy would claim it as it claims all. Millions of years later, a paleontologist might retrieve one fragment, a shard of worked stone or a curious alloy embedded in sandstone. Would it be seen as artifact or simply anomaly? What separates a relic of lost hands from a natural shape created by pressure and fracture? Perhaps the hidden technofossil thought is less about evidence and more about humility. It invites us to imagine our own impermanence, to recognize that what we call lasting is always provisional. Not because the earth is hostile to memory, but because its memory is vast, and in vastness, individuals and even civilizations may dissolve into fractions too small to truly stand apart. What we leave, then, may not be monuments or architecture, but changes in chemistry, rearrangements in stone, signatures hidden within isotopes for someone else, somewhere else to someday notice. And yet, if it is true that civilizations may vanish as completely as species, if even intelligence could dissolve into anonymous dust, then what comfort can we take from the fact that something always endures? Whether through fossils, isotopes, stone, or silence, the earth itself will always remember. We only wonder what form that memory will take next. When the rains came across Pangea, they did not arrive as gentle showers. They thundered. Weeks, sometimes months, of relentless downpour struck the plains and valleys, rivers swelling into torrents that swept away soil, bone, and forest alike. The ground became liquid, reshaping itself with each surge. Floodplains expanded into temporary seas. Hills collapsed into slurry. Whole herds that once walked confidently upon solid paths found themselves forced into flight, stumbling as currents carried them into silence. Yet once the clouds broke, once the storms moved on, the world held its breath. What followed disaster was not chaos but stillness, as if the planet itself paused to listen to what had just occurred. This silence was fragile. It lay across plains where floodwaters stretched into reflective basins, holding the quiet of sky in their new surfaces. It shimmered over forests stripped of branches, where broken trunks stood like blackened spines waiting for regrowth. It lingered in valleys where the roar of cascading water had vanished, leaving behind channels of new sediment that glistened under hesitant sun. To walk in such a world would have been to hear not emptiness, but suspension, to sense that life itself was recalibrating, taking measure of what was lost before adjusting to resume again. Science tells us such shifts are preserved in the sediments left behind. Layers of mudstone mark intervals of flooding, evidence of repeated deluges sealed into rock. Isotopic signals whisper of changing climates, where prolonged drought tipped suddenly into abundance, then back again. Each storm reset ecosystems, wiping away what had begun to assemble, depositing nutrients in one region only to strip them from another. The aftermath of storms was not mere destruction. It was redistribution, part of Earth's long rhythm. In this way, silence after rain meant future potential, waiting beneath new layers of sediment that would one day hold roots, pollen, and the beginnings of life's return. For the creatures who endured, silence was transition. Herbivores returned cautiously to the plains, searching for shoots amid silt-choked soil. Predators skulked at the edges, aware that floods had carried weaker prey away. Insects worked immediately, breaking down the debris, recycling what had drowned into matter ready for roots. Forests, though scarred, reached again for sky, their seeds dispersed by storm now scattered across wider ground. Within a generation, what seemed devastated stirred again with beginnings. That fragile silence was not absence. It was a prologue, the interval between a chord struck violently and the next note in Earth's soft, ongoing song. Philosophically, this silence after storms is familiar beyond geology. We know it after our own upheavals, when noise falls away and we are left in the suspended moment of aftermath. It is neither comfort nor despair, but space. A pause that tells us that memory takes time to settle, that new rhythms will arise but not immediately. The Earth, too, held such intervals. Silence after the storm reminded all creatures that resilience is not instantaneous. It waits, breaths long and slow, before returning. And so, in the record of Pangea, these intervals of quiet endure. Fossil beds at times show not abundance but scarcity, reduced diversity lingering for thousands of years after floods or storms. And then, slowly, more footprints appear again. More pollen fills the soil, more bones return to layers above. Silence was not permanence. It was part of the cycle, evidence that Earth itself required pauses in which to transform the pace of its own memory. Imagine standing at the edge of a floodplain just after the waters receded. Pools glint in the distance, mist rises from damp air, and not a sound breaks except the slow dripping of water leaving branches. For a moment, even insects seem to still their wings. That is the silence of aftermath, the fragile recognition of what has shifted and the quiet patience before continuation. This silence is not erasure. It is the breath between verses in a song without end. And yet, if silence was a rhythm after storms, then what of the soil itself, where decay and entropy built a quieter library still, an archive not of storms that passed quickly, but of time stretching endlessly beneath our very feet? Soil is often overlooked, seen as common, anonymous dust beneath our feet. But beneath the vast expanse of Pangea, soil was far more than background. It was process. It was archive. It was, in a way, Earth's first library. A place where bodies dissolved into their smallest forms, where forests decayed into nutrients, and where generations of life inscribed their memory grain by grain into the planet itself. What we think of as dirt was, and is, a layered record of everything that came before, written not in words but in entropy. Entropy works most patiently here. Leaves fall, decompose, and vanish into fragments invisible to the eye. Animal remains collapse into bone, then calcium, then mineral dust return to mix with root and stone. Each addition seems insignificant. A single autumn of leaves, a single generation returned to ground. And yet, over millions of years, the soil becomes thick with accumulation, its chemistry bearing witness to climate, storm, drought, and flood. In its endless churn, entropy is at work, not negating life, but transforming it into memory stored beneath the surface, waiting for us to trace with patient eyes. Scientists study soil as if they are reading this library page by page. Oxygen isotopes, locked within tiny minerals, reveal the presence of wetter intervals, monsoon cycles that once swept the continent. Carbon isotopes whisper of plant types, of forests rich in conifers versus plains dominated by grasses and drought-resistant flora. Even nitrogen residues carried forward in organic matter mark moments of abundance or scarcity, recording whether life flourished widely or barely clung on. Soil has the grace of quiet honesty. It remembers what grew upon it, what fell into it, and what it absorbed without judgment. But beyond its science, there is wonder in the thought that soil itself holds voices that cannot speak. Each handful is more than dust, it is memory made material. To touch ancient soils preserved in Pangea's red earth is to brush against countless endings folded into continuation. Within those layers, you encounter not individuals but entire systems collapsed and recycled. The forests that towered, the herds that grazed, the storms that pulled trees from the ground, all moved eventually into dust, and that dust never disappeared. It became the foundation for what followed. Perhaps there is philosophy in this, that forgetting and remembrance are not opposites, but part of the same cycle, and soil is the proof. Imagine standing in the silence after rain, sinking your hand into a cut of earth freshly exposed by erosion. Between your fingers are particles of long-vanished forests, atoms of creatures whose names we will never speak, chemical traces of climates that no longer exist. Soil is paradox. Fragile enough to blow away in wind, vast enough to remember hundreds of millions of years. It collects without prioritizing and holds without intention. The giants walked above, leaving bones. The forests stretched beyond horizon, leaving trunks. But soil took everything. Large and small, silence and storm, presence and absence, and folded them together until the ground itself became the book of time. There is humility in recognizing this. We walk across soil daily, seldom thinking of its patience, its silent accumulation of memory. And yet, beneath every step lies testimony, each layer a reminder that nothing escapes entropy's pull. And though entropy disperses form, soil reorganizes it into continuity. This is why soil truly is archive, and why it may be Earth's most enduring one. Geologists now study ancient Pangean soils as clues for worlds otherwise lost. Paleosols, fossil soils, show root channels preserved in hardened stone, chemical residues still readable after millions of years. Within them, we learn of drought-charred intervals, of times when rains did not come, of cycles where green returned once more. Again and again, entropy whispered through these layers, dispersing detail but preserving essence. That life rises and falls, but its material always remains. Perhaps this is the hidden lesson in Earth's library of dirt. That decay itself is not the end, but a transformation into permanence of a subtler kind. Soil does not preserve perfectly, but it preserves relentlessly. Forgotten in one sense, remembered in another. Our presence, too, will one day join this archive, folded into the patient chemistry of layers that will later be read, long after voices and names are gone. And yet, if the soils of Pangea could remember so quietly, storing whole climates in dust, then what of the creatures who rose above them, those whose shadows stretched longest, whose reign shaped everything around them, and whose legacy still lingers in stone? On the vast stage of Pangea, under skies threaded with pterosaurs and across plains stirred by migrating giants, another lineage began to rise, creatures whose very presence would leave echoes that have never truly faded. The dinosaurs, at first modest among other reptiles, became figures written deeply into the Earth's unfolding story. They carried not just their bodies forward, but entire rhythms of survival intertwined with the planet's own cycles of entropy and renewal. In their steps, we hear patterns larger than themselves. Balance and loss, abundance and silence, an ongoing dialogue between life and change. Dinosaurs were not immediately conquerors of their world. They began as one branch among many, adapting quietly, testing strategies of size, stride, and diet. Where forests stretched, some became browsers, lifting heads into canopies, shaping their skeletons to reach what others could not. Where shadows lengthened across plains, others became predators, building teeth and claw to match the speed of prey. They were experiments in motion, each body a negotiation with the landscape. And with each experiment came a chance at continuity. The fossil record does not show victory written in one moment, but patience, diversity, adaptations spread across centuries that eventually tilted in their favor. Their memory is not only in bones but in the chemistry of those bones. Isotopes of oxygen trace their drinking patterns, suggesting long migrations through climates alternating wet and dry. Minerals laid down in their teeth and claws contain carbon signatures of diet, revealing whether they moved within lush forests or dry grasslands. Through these records, we see not individuals but networks of survival, cycles of life bent always by water, vegetation, atmosphere. The dinosaurs, much like the soil or rivers, carried within them the memory of the earth itself. Their very being was a transcription of climate. And yet, in their scale and duration, dinosaurs transcended simply being participants. They became landscapers of ecosystems. Herds of herbivorous species reshaped vegetation wherever they traveled, dispersing seeds, cycling nutrients, opening clearings that allowed forests to regenerate anew. Predators balanced these herds, ensuring excess did not collapse the plains themselves. Even their deaths fed systems broader than their lives. Bodies became sediment, nutrients became soil, bones, in rare cases, became fossils threading their presence into the geological archive. They were not separate from Earth's entropy, but partners to it, stepping rhythmically with its endless turn of renewal through loss. Imagine their long shadows stretching across the plains at dusk, hundreds of bodies moving together as thunder rolled in the distance. To exist among them would have been to see horizon replaced by motion, ecosystems rising and falling around their footsteps. They seemed vast, yes, but not eternal. Like all life, they lived within the boundaries Earth offered. Droughts tested them as they did all creatures. Volcanic skies shadowed their movements. Climate cycles carved winners and losers from among their kind. Entire species vanished unnoticed to make room for others. And still, their lineage endured, adapting across millions of years, a testament not to dominance alone, but to resilience within change. Philosophically, their presence invites a question. Why does their memory endure with such fascination? Perhaps because they embody the paradox of scale. They were immense, powerful, dreadfully alive, and yet all are gone. Their bones litter stone, their structures beautiful in their silence. They remind us that size, strength, even ubiquity do not spare any lineage from entropy's hand. To stand among their fossils is to know deep humility, to recognize that our own age, so certain of itself, may also one day stand as shadow, no different from theirs. And yet, in another way, the shadow of dinosaurs is unending. They did not vanish entirely. Descendants linger today as birds, carrying in their hollow bones, their feathers, their genetic signatures, the quiet continuation of an ancient reign. The forests and skies still reverberate with traces of their presence. They remind us that extinction is rarely total. Often it is transformation, lineage bending into new form. The long shadow is not only across time but across breadth, the planet remembering through continuity even as it forgets through disappearance. When we walk now along cliffs and see embedded skeletons curved in stone, the fascination comes not only from shape but from permanence of memory. These creatures stood within the same flows of entropy, and yet, like fossils of vanished forests or insects in amber, they managed to leave testimony behind. Their shadow is long because it is double, part written in stone, part written in imagination. The fossils give shape, but our wonder fills in voice, color, movement. In this way they live on, carried through both geology and thought. And so we live with dinosaurs still, not in their towering forms, but in their enduring shadow. They remind us of survival bound to climates, of impermanence tied to endurance, of transformation hidden in extinction. They were creatures of their time, yet they extend beyond it as Earth itself does. Their shadow stretches into us, reminding us that we too are players in a system far greater than ourselves, subject to the same entropy, the same renewal. And yet, if dinosaurs could cast such a shadow across both stone and imagination, what of the skies they lived beneath? The very stars that bore silent witness, unchanged while ages of giants rose and fell below? Above Pangea's vastness, beyond plains and rivers and deserts, there stretched a sky that looked, in many ways, not so different from the one we know now. Every evening, when the last amber light bled from the horizon and dust settled into stillness, the night unfolded, an ink-black canvas scattered with stars. They witnessed it all. Giants grazing in twilight, predators crouched in shadow, insects resuming their endless work. The stars saw these lives without interruption, their constellations fixed in patterns older than forests, older even than the supercontinent itself. And yet, how different they must have appeared through the eyes of Pangea's inhabitants. The dinosaurs may have watched the same constellations we trace today, though they had no language to connect the points. Pterosaurs wheeling at dusk would have flown through the very same arc of the Milky Way. Early mammals, peering from nests and burrows beneath quiet shrubs, would have looked upward at pinpricks of silver made more vivid by the clarity of ancient air. The stars were the only permanence amid a world of shifting climate and restless stone. They outlasted every drought, every eruption, every extinction. They were the silent memory keepers, unchanging in their positions while continents drifted beneath. Science reminds us that the stars themselves are not motionless. They, too, travel their own paths across the galaxy, shifting ever so subtly across thousands and millions of years. But from the perspective of Earth, their patterns persist across human and pre-human generations, giving the illusion of steadiness. What we call constellations, the hunter, the swan, the scorpion, are human names for lights carried unchanged across epochs. To Pangea's living world, these same constellations were present, though unmarked, glimmering just as constant to reptile eyes as to ours. There is wonder in this continuity. We are so focused on bones, on fossils, on shifting soils and seas, yet above, the stars provide a memory far older. They serve as bridges across time, linking us invisibly with every creature that has ever lived. To pause beneath them is to step into a shared inheritance, a cosmic roof that does not distinguish between ages. The same light that falls on your face tonight fell too on the scales of giant reptiles and the fur of the smallest mammal hidden in Pangea's brush. The stars reduce us all to observers, part of a lineage of watching. Imagine a herd gathered on an open plain at dusk, their enormous bodies silhouetted in fading light. As they rest, lifting heads briefly toward shifting air, stars flicker overhead. They do not name them. They do not trace their shapes or wonder at their permanence. And still, in that unspoken gaze, the earth loops memory forward, creatures of deep time looking upward at the same distant suns we chart today. Perhaps this is why the night sky feels so profound. It is not only ours. It belongs to every life that ever paused beneath it, to every silence stretched between dusk and dawn. Philosophically, stars remind us that time can feel both fleeting and infinite. Forests fall, deserts spread, glaciers creep and retreat, yet the points of light remain unchanged enough to be mistaken for eternal. They show us that change and constancy coexist, that while Earth cycles endlessly through entropy and renewal, above it all there lingers something beyond, something that reduces millions of years into a single shared ceiling. Stars do not preserve fossils, nor sediments, nor isotopes. They preserve instead the feeling of looking upward, and act as old as life with eyes. And yet, even this permanence is illusion. One day these stars too will shift, burn out, or be replaced with new lights in new skies. But for now, they remain the longest thread we can follow backward, connecting us to Pangea, to all its vanished creatures, to every silent gaze turned skyward before memory itself had words. And yet, if stars could outlast even the continents and shine across ages unchanged, what of the habitats below them? The forests, grasslands, and deserts that never held still, always transitioning, always reweaving the stage of life? On Pangea, no place ever remained what it seemed. Landscapes that looked eternal in the span of a lifetime were, in truth, already changing, already bending toward something new. Forest could open into grassland. Desert might transform into wetland. Shallow seas drew back to reveal plains, while rivers altered course and abandoned valleys. Nothing stood fixed. To live in this world was to move upon a stage that rewrote itself continually, each shift carrying both loss and renewal. Ecology itself was not static but a memory constantly revising its pages. The transformations unfolded through climate's restless breath. Monsoon patterns thickened with rains one age, then faded in another, drying forests into savannas. Volcanoes laid down blankets of ash that, after barrenness, enriched soil for new cycles of growth. Glaciers advanced and retreated, shifting coastlines and draining basins, turning once green expanses into tundra or lakes. Life had no choice but to adapt, following these transitions, bending itself around the temporary shape of each habitat. In the soil, pollen and spores recorded these shifts, fragment by fragment, revealing the slow replacement of one ecosystem with another. Isotopes hidden in these same deposits call quietly across time. Drier, wetter, hotter, colder. The messages are never static. They are proof of eternal motion. Fossils capture this reality too. Bones are found not always where we expect them, because the land beneath their final steps had once been something else entirely. A skeleton found in red sandstone tells of creatures laying down their lives in land once desert, but fragments of aquatic life appear within those same rocks, reminding us the ground had earlier been a lake. These juxtapositions are not contradictions, but the truth of habitats in transition. The continent was always sketching itself anew, erasing lines and redrawing them within a much slower rhythm than any creature living atop it could have noticed. From a creature's perspective, the changes must have seemed gradual and imperceptible. A forest thinning slightly year after year. A river branching differently as silt accumulated. New spaces opening, new refuges closing. No animal would have understood these transformations as global, but each responded intimately through migration, through adaptation, through silence when options grew too few. Species did not just live on the Earth. They lived with the Earth, their lives braided with the planet's transitions. Perhaps there is a lesson here for us. We crave permanence. The forest as enduring, the desert as eternal, the sea as infinite. Yet Pangea whispers otherwise. Permanence is an illusion. What looks fixed is perpetually dissolving into something else. Each habitat is only one page in a longer story, its text rewritten by rain, by drought, by wind, by entropy itself. To recognize this is not despair. It is humility. Shifting landscapes remind us that memory is not a single frame, but a weave of successive images, seen best only in retrospect. Philosophically, these transitions carry a paradox. Loss feeds renewal. The forests that collapsed into savannas nourish soils where grasses proliferated. The lakes that dried into deserts left behind basins rich with salt and minerals, waiting for the return of water. Death and disappearance carved openings for new configurations. The very idea of stability was a temporary mirage. Ecology, like memory, survives by changing, not by staying the same. Imagine standing at the boundary of such change. On one side, green, familiar forest. On the other, open plains stretching farther each season. The air holds both realities. The scent of resin from old trees, the dust lifted from new grass. To look here is to glimpse transition itself, a moment where two memories overlap before one replaces the other entirely. These boundaries moved across Pangea without end, reshaping lives wherever they passed. Geology records them as subtle shifts in soil, fossils layered in different combinations, sediments colored by changing chemistry. The rocks do not speak loudly of drama, but softly of patience. They show us that transformation is not anomaly but essence. To live upon Earth is to dwell among habitats of transition, each space a moving threshold between what was and what will be. And so, habitats of Pangea remind us, no place stayed the same, no landscape remained permanent. Ecosystems flowed one into another as memory itself flowed into forgetting. And yet, if even landscapes could flicker from form to form, what about extinction itself? The mathematics hidden within those disappearances, the quiet equations that calculated how worlds would vanish and return. Extinction often feels like silence, the last breath of a creature dissolving into air, the absence that follows when a species no longer walks the earth. And yet, hidden beneath this silence lies something more intricate: numbers. For every disappearance, there are patterns and rates, probabilities quietly tallied by the physics of survival and the chemistry of time. Behind each vanishing species, there lingers a hidden mathematics, a quiet song traced not in melody but in statistics, spiraling softly through the fossil record. Paleontology teaches us that extinction is not simply random erasure. It carries rhythm. Background extinctions, ordinary disappearances of species, occur at rates so steady they form a baseline against which the great catastrophes stand apart. Perhaps 1 to 5 species vanished for every million species each year, so subtle it could pass unnoticed except in deep reconstructions of time. Then, sometimes came the spikes. Mass extinctions, dramatic accelerations where worlds tipped in weeks, decades, or centuries far below the planet's long patience. Mathematics captures this difference not as drama but curve, showing us smooth lines disrupted by sharp breaks, graphs whispering where biology bent too far to rebound. The fossils themselves contain this numbering. Isotopes locked in ancient shells or bones provide ratios revealing crises long past. Carbon isotopes testify to shifts in the planet's breath, swings of atmosphere that suffocated life slowly or suddenly. Oxygen isotopes reveal the pulse of climate, tilting warmer or cooler in spans too swift for adaptation. Strontium and sulfur trace ocean chemistry, storms of acidification or anoxic seas where whole lineages drowned in silence. Each isotope is a digit in Earth's great ledger. And from digits patterns form, patterns that sing of loss. Entropy, too, works by number. Half-lives count the fading of radioactive isotopes, clocks we read backward to measure how long ago extinction claimed what now lies in stone. Each fossil carries its timestamp, sealed by decay not of memory but of atoms. Some vanish faster, like carbon-14, tracing more recent flickers. Others, like uranium or potassium, outlast civilizations, marking epochs into deep time. The mathematics of decay tells us precisely what has gone, even as it humbles us with how much remains immeasurable. But what is mathematics without meaning? Beyond the numbers lies philosophy, the recognition that extinction, however quantified, is still loss. Numbers make the patterns visible, but they cannot capture the breath of the final individual, the stillness of the last herd gazing into horizons already empty. The statistics are essential yet incomplete, offering form without feeling, scale without sorrow. Perhaps the beauty of mathematics in extinction is not that it explains everything, but that it reminds us life and death themselves obey larger rhythms beyond perception. Death is not random. It is part of an equation too vast for any single species to solve. Imagine standing on Pangea's plains as numbers accumulate invisibly. One lineage thinning at the margins of a drought. Another unable to find niche when competition grows sharper. A generation ending with no successor, its absence unnoticed except by predators who wander away hungry. From above, the statistics gather, percentages shifting, probabilities recalculating. What looks to us now like tragedy was, to the planet, part of its ongoing balance. Extinction is not only subtraction. It is also transition, a mathematical refiguring of ecosystems into new shapes. Each disappearance reweights the equation of life, creating silence that makes room for sound anew. The mathematics of extinction is seen not only in DNA lines snipped away or fossils catalogued, but in the ripple effects forward. When one species falls, others shift, abundances change, ratios tilt. Equations cascade outward. Fewer prey, more pressure on predators. More plants, shifts in soil balance. Fewer pollinators, forests altered. None of it random, all of it following the logic of interconnection. The web of life is itself an equation. Not fixed but recursive, looping endlessly, recalibrating whenever a variable disappears. Perhaps numbers are the most faithful witnesses we have. Long after forests have burned, after bones have cracked, mathematics endures silently. Ratios in chemicals, half-lives of isotopes, distribution curves of fossils across layers of sediment. They are not dramatic, but they are incorruptible. They tell us plainly, if we are willing to listen, that extinction is as patterned as it is sorrowful, that erasure itself follows order. Philosophically, this ordering raises questions. Do numbers reduce extinction to abstractions, stripping it of mourning? Or do they elevate it, revealing that even endings participate in beauty too vast to see? Perhaps mathematics is not cold but compassionate, offering us coherence, a reminder that nothing vanishes outside the frame of planetary law. Every silence has scale, every loss has proportion. In learning these patterns, we hear, faintly, that extinction is not chaos but song. Its notes mournful, but never broken, spiraling endlessly in the score of time. And yet, if extinction itself is governed by mathematics, etched as equations inside stone, then what of the ghosts of all those vanished lives, the unseen remnants pressed beneath our feet? Could it be that absence itself leaves a record, not in numbers alone, but in the quiet echoes hidden just below where we walk? When we walk across the ground today, it feels solid, known, ordinary. Yet beneath every step lies a depth we scarcely acknowledge, a buried archive sealed in silence. Under our feet stretch unwritten libraries, where fossils and pollen, sediments and trace imprints rest in patience, unread pages of Pangea's deep and forgotten chapters. The earth remembers, but it does not speak freely. It waits, stone-bound, for us to uncover the ghosts it carries. The ground itself is layered with memory. Each stratum holds fragments of what once moved or grew, compressed over millions of years into silent testimony. A rib pressed into sandstone, a fern leaf stamped into shale, a scattering of pollen trapped in mud that turns slowly into siltstone. All of these lie hidden from our daily eyes. They persist not on the surface, but buried beneath fields, cities, deserts, seas. What seems to us like empty ground is a palimpsest written again and again. The earlier texts rubbed faint but never entirely erased. If we could read with geological sight, every path we crossed would tell us not just of the present world, but of the vanished one underneath. Paleontology trains us to recognize these hidden presences. Fossils found today remind us that countless others lie undiscovered, their forms locked beneath deeper stone, or fractured into fragments delicate beyond recognition. For every skeleton unearthed, there are hundreds more still sleeping. Even microscopic pollen grains, invisible to casual eyes, have endured in ancient soils, each grain a capsule of vanished ecosystems. Chemical isotopes preserved in that same earth whisper still, testifying to climates that shifted across the supercontinent long before our awareness. It is humbling to realize that we walk across these archives daily without knowing the meaning of what lies so close. There is a haunting quality to this thought. To step anywhere is to tread atop ghosts, recordings not of voices but of presence, impressions long past yet held intact. Every road, every garden, every mountain trail overlays a hidden world of vanished rivers, long dead herds, vanished forests. Perhaps the silence of these ghosts is not emptiness, but protection. Critical details lie hidden until the right erosion exposes them, until human hands gently lift stone to see the story pressed inside. They survive by waiting, existing beyond the impatience of memory, held steady in entropy's embrace. Philosophically, this realization unsettles permanence. We imagine the present as solid, yet the present is always underlain by absence. Every step rests on remnants of what came before. Whether we choose to see them or not, we are never apart from them. This is how memory works, too. Layer after layer, some visible, others forgotten, some rising suddenly to the surface in unexpected moments. The earth carries its memory in stone, just as we carry ours in silence. Both archives are incomplete, yet both endure. Imagine standing on a Pangean floodplain millions of years ago. Herds pass across soft mud, pressing tracks that vanish by morning rain. Insects trail across rotting bark. Fish skeletons settle into drowned channels. For a moment, these seem ephemeral, already dismissed. And yet, some of those marks endure even now, buried beneath kilometers of stone, waiting. We step perhaps above them daily, not knowing their exact places, carrying on across land whose depth we rarely consider. Beneath modern soil and concrete lie these quiet memories, sealed shadows of a living earth that never forgets. Science shows us that such ghosts endure because of processes both fragile and precise. To fossilize, the conditions must align. Quick burial, protection from oxygen, intrusion of minerals in steady seepage. For pollen, entrapment in mud or resin protected them from obliteration. For isotopes, it is chemical stability that allows them to linger as signatures of vanished atmospheres. The ghosts beneath our feet are not random miracles, but improbable survivals chosen by chance, written into stone by conditions most life never experienced. And yet, they remind us that even absence can speak. Every layer without fossils tells us something, too. It says the environment was against preservation, or that silence itself left no witness. Even what is missing is informative. It joins the archive as a kind of negative space, a blank sentence that still belongs to the record of Earth. Perhaps the ghosts are less haunting than they are reassuring. They remind us that nothing truly vanishes. It only changes form, disperses, waits. One day far in the future, our bones, our tools, even our technologies may slip beneath sediment, our presence reduced to signal in isotope, imprint in metal, shard in plastic. Then we, too, will join the hidden library beneath the feet of someone else who wonders what lies unseen below. So when we walk, we step not only on ground, but on archives, on layers of silence that once rang with life. Beneath us lie the ghosts of rivers, forests, herds, seasons. They do not speak loudly, but they endure. And yet, if beneath the soil we find such memory, what then when the earth itself begins to tear apart, when the continent of Pangea fractures into drifting shards, reshaping not only habitats, but the archive of time itself? The breaking of Pangea did not come as a sudden shattering. No single day announced the fracture, no cataclysm visible to the creatures moving across its surface. Instead, it unfolded in silence stretched across millions of years. Beneath the soils and forests, slow rifts began to pull apart. Magma pressed upward, filling seams with fire, pushing continents outward 1 millimeter at a time. Mountains trembled, valleys widened, oceans seeped into new basins. What had been one body, one vast supercontinent, began to dissolve into fragments destined to drift into the shapes we know today. The ground itself became impermanence. Landscapes carried away, identities reshaped, memory rewritten by tectonic force. For the creatures of Pangea, the fractures would have been unfelt. Herds still grazed, rivers still wandered, forests spread and retreated with climate. Yet beneath them, the Earth's plates pulled apart, tiny motions accumulating until the geography they had always known transformed entirely. Habitats split and disconnected. Where once migrations stretched seamlessly across grasslands, seas began to intrude, blocking corridors with water. Species that once lived side by side found themselves separated by widening gulfs, their lineages diverging into isolation. Evolution accelerated through division, familiar forms becoming unfamiliar across drifting continents, all born from the memory of land once whole. Geology leaves this transformation as vivid record. Rift valleys scar the crust in patterns mirrored today by Africa's Great Rift and Iceland's steaming fissures, modern echoes of what Pangea endured. In the stone of ancient margins, we see basalt flows, lavas hardened from the first split of continents. Marine sediments now stranded inland remind us where seas once rushed into the gaps. Fossils, too, map the fracture. Identical fern imprints found in South America and Africa, identical reptile bones in India and Antarctica. Their separation tells us they once lived together on a unified land. The drifting continents carry with them testimony of this rupture, like broken pages torn from a larger book, scattered yet still speaking of their common origin. But beyond geology, there is philosophy in this slow breaking. Pangea's division reminds us that wholeness is not permanent, that even the greatest unions contain within them the seeds of eventual separation. No mountain range is eternal. No landmass holds forever. Just as ecosystems reshape, just as species rise and vanish, even the continents themselves participate in entropy's widening drift. The present order of the Earth, Atlantic Ocean here, Indian Ocean there, scattered continents drifting apart, is not timeless truth. It is simply the current arrangement of fragments from that ancient whole. To know Pangea broke is to know that one day our present world will fracture again, into new shapes we cannot yet imagine. And still, the memory of unity lingers in what survives. The animals that roamed its forests left fossils scattered across continents that now stand oceans apart. The soils enriched by volcanic ash still bear residues of climates disrupted by rifting. Even the species shaped by division, the lineages that evolved differently in separated lands, carry in their DNA the story of that divergence. The memory of Pangea is not erased by its fracture. It lives on in separation itself, each continent holding a piece, each reminding us of the unity they once shared. To imagine standing at the edges of the first rift is to feel both awe and humility. Perhaps there were lakes sinking into fault valleys, steam rising as groundwater scalded where magma pressed upward. Perhaps forests at the margins crumbled as ground dropped away, replaced by lagoons and basins. To the animals there, these were local changes, challenges of habitat. None could grasp the continental scale. None could see that over unfathomable spans their world was cutting in two, in three, in many. They lived their lives as always, seasons of hunger, seasons of rest, while beneath them the very foundation shifted into a new order. Philosophically, the breaking of Pangea is not just a geological event, but a metaphor for memory itself. Just as land fractures and scatters, so too does recollection. We remember in fragments, scattered across years, each piece carrying something of the whole but never the entirety. The scattered continents are fossils of memory, incomplete, divided, yet sufficient to remind us of their origin. To study them is to reconstruct a story larger than any part, stitching fragments back into unity within imagination. Memory, like land, may break apart, but in its fragments lies the whisper of the original whole. Even now, when we look at maps, we can see the fit. Africa's west coast cupping into South America's east, India's drift upward into Asia, Antarctica's ice burying a fragment far from everything else. The continents are still moving, still drifting slowly on the mantle's restless currents. The Earth has not finished its long reshaping. What feels permanent to us is only pause. And so, just as Pangea dissolved into pieces, so too will the fragments we inhabit today stitch into something new millions of years hence. Another supercontinent will be born, another union, another inevitable fracture. The cycle does not end. And yet, if the breaking of a continent can carry its memory forward across scattered ages, what of silence itself? What lingers when all else dissolves, when even voices fade, and Earth remembers through absence rather than presence? In closing, we return to the question that has lingered through every page of Pangea's story. The question of memory, of what endures when voices fade, when bodies collapse into dust, when forests slip into stone and oceans pull back into silence. We have walked the plains of giants, traced the rivers that carried silt and song, drifted across the skies with shadows of wings, and stood in deserts where silence ruled. We have seen forests fossilized, soils instructing us in whispers, isotopes preserving the rhythm of climate as faithfully as any heart might keep time. And through it all, the Earth has reminded us that its memory is not like ours. It is slower, wider, less concerned with detail and more with endurance. A memory written not in words but in stone. Bones carry the memory of bodies, but they do so incompletely. Few survive into fossil, fewer still are uncovered. And yet, those fragments remind us that even dissolution can be interrupted, that chance can preserve what otherwise would vanish. Soil remembers in chemistry, carbon isotopes testifying to forests, oxygen ratios breathing of drought and flood. The sky endures in stars, light older than any fossil, reaching across time unfazed by the continents breaking apart. Dust, too, bears witness, carrying fragments from one place to another, scattering what fell into the silence of one valley into the archive of another. Each layer of earth whispers something different, a chorus of subtle testimonies. And listening to them shows us that memory is not absence defeated, but presence reshaped. Perhaps this is the truest lesson of silence, that it is never empty. What sounds like void is in fact filled with echoes too soft for us to hear. Beneath our feet lie fossils unseen. Within stone lie atmospheres long dissolved. In the cores of ice rest the breaths of vanished winds. Silence is therefore not oblivion. It is simply the interval between voice and recognition. Extinction is silence, yes, but it does not erase. It transforms. The earth, ever patient, continues breathing, and in that breathing it continues to hold what once was. If memory for us is a fragile attempt to grasp detail, memory for the earth is endurance through transformation. We forget names within decades. Forests persist as coal for hundreds of millions of years. Our words vanish into silence, but isotopes in bone may endure long past our species. Our monuments crumble, but bacterial signatures may remain in sedimentary layers for unimaginable spans. It is humbling to see that memory is not dependent on consciousness. The planet remembers without mind, without voice, in the chemical insistence of matter refusing to disappear. And so, what endures? Not the roar of dinosaurs, not the songs of insects in vanished forests, not even the calls of mammals that hid in shadows. What endures is the pattern of their existence, preserved subtly in the fabric of earth. The dust remembers presence. The stone remembers form. The isotopes remember climate. The silence remembers all, though never in detail we might wish for. Maybe this is why we wonder. To fill the gaps left by silence, to give voice to ghosts made mute by time. Our imagination is as much part of the archive as the fossils we uncover. We give stories back to bones. We retrace forgotten skies. We name constellations that were once only light. In doing so, we, too, become part of Earth's memory, our wonder fossilized into narrative. Philosophically, there is comfort in this. For if even silence contains memory, then forgetting is never absolute. Nothing is truly erased. It only takes a form beyond our seeing. The forests of Pangea have burned away, yet their pollen remains under microscopes. The rivers have carved new channels, yet their sediments lie in stone, telling of storm and stillness alike. Entire continents have broken and drifted, yet the fit of their edges recalls when they once were whole. Against such vastness, our own impermanence feels smaller, yes, but also less final. We too will return to dust. We too will pass into isotopes and chemistry. The earth will carry us forward, not as individuals perhaps, but as traces in stone, as marks in entropy's long archive. So what endures when voices fade? It may not be our stories, nor our monuments, nor even our names. What endures is Earth itself, its breathing, its vast cycles of entropy and renewal. Memory does not vanish. It transforms into pattern, into silence that is nonetheless filled with presence. And when we press our hands to the ground, or gaze into night skies, or listen to the slow pulse of waves, we touch that endurance. We feel not our place at the center of things, but our thread woven quietly into the fabric of the planet's longer song. And perhaps that is the only answer worth holding on to, that what endures is the breathing earth, holding all of us, remembering not as we remember, but as silence does, patiently, incompletely, infinitely. And yet, if even silence carries memory, perhaps the truest archive of all is not what lies beneath us, nor even what shines above, but what we choose to wonder in the present moment. For wonder itself, fleeting though it may be, is also endurance, a bridge between what has been and what is yet to come.